Okay, do we open up the commission meeting or?
Yeah, let's open up the commission meeting, and it's a study session, so it's gonna be a little bit different, but we will have someone presenting remote too, right? Abe?
Yes.
Okay, so we might want to check if they're is that him?
Should,
Around the phone?
No, that's not, it's completion.
Oh, okay.
okay, I'm sorry, should we stop at the pledge allegiance? We'll do the call to order, pledge allegiance, and then roll call.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, this meeting is called to order at 5:08. The pledge allegiance.
Please rise. Put your hand over your heart. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Get roll call again.
Okay, Commissioner Ramirez,
Present.
Commissioner Murillo,
Present.
Commissioner Arvizo,
Present.
Vice Chair Hernandez. Absent. Alternate Commissioner Fonseca. Absent. And Chair Gonzalez.
The president.
Well, this is a study session item for the Planning Commission on updates from the state housing law. But we are looking for our guest presenter. So we'll see if he'll be able to log in. So maybe there are some challenges.
Yeah, he was trying to connect to the Zoom. I'm sending him again the info.
Maybe I can start off the background to this. So there's been a series of housing laws that have been passed in the state. And so if you look at your regular agenda, there's an item that we talk about later called the objective design standards. So I talk about a few of those laws that have passed since 2017. One's SB 35 that streamlines the development of multifamily housing and mixed use development, like and also SB 330. That's another law that's passed that does make it challenging for cities to be able to change their land use from higher land use to a lower density land use. So we've experienced these challenges at the city when developers are interested in developing lower density housing in the city. So in the desert area, a lot of the bigger developers that try to develop are really trying to develop lower density single family neighborhoods. Though our zoning has a lot of higher density zoning, and that accommodates multifamily housing. But we don't have a lot of the bigger builders that are interested in building that type of housing in the city. Now we welcome it. A lot of other cities wouldn't welcome that type of development. But you know, we could create all the policies that would allow for that type of housing to exist here, but someone has to build it, right? So it's either, you know, affordable housing developer or a market rate developer that has to build it. And so the builders that have been coming in are single family housing developers. And so they've run into challenges where they've found sites in the city that are higher density. They want to change it to lower density. In the past, it was easier to do that, but the state has made it more difficult to do that because the state wants to make sure that there's a higher capacity to yield more units on land within cities in California. So so we wanted to go over some of the housing law, and I don't know if you were having any luck.
Yeah, I was just talking to him. He was trying to log on. I know that's, I'm trying to make sure that he's using the correct one for the study session.
So there's, yeah, because there's two agendas and one for the study session. Are you using the one for the study? The same Zoom? Okay.
Oh, it is? Okay. Yeah, he has it.
I think there are any other ways that we can make this work.
Sure, let me ask.
Okay.
Having.
Here we go.
Oh, there you go.
And Abe, do you want to go ahead and introduce Todd, I guess, when he's ready?
Yeah, of course. Hey, Todd, are you on?
I am. Thank you.
Chair and Planning Commissioners, this is Todd Leishman. He's a partner at Beth Weston Krieger, who's in our housing working group, specializes in housing work. So he's going to give a presentation to you all on SB 330.
Thank you.
Welcome, Doug.
Thank you. So I wasn't sure today if you had questions that you wanted me to address, or if you're just looking for an overview of SB 330.
I
Why
think
don't
an
we start with
overview,
that?
yeah, an overview and maybe some detail in exactly what it consists of.
Okay,
Chairman, if I may add, it would be great to go over what the director just mentioned, that is to go over SB 35 and SB 330 and just like a high level overview, and to the chairman's point, provide some detail so we can have better understanding, so we can make better decisions and, you know, have a productive conversation.
well, this might be the first of a couple of conversations then.
Thank you.
So just to start out with, SB 330, I'm sorry, SB 35 preceded SB 330. This was adopted a few years ago, and it makes certain kinds of multifamily projects permissible by right. The city has to approve them ministerially, and they need affordable. There has to be an affordable housing component, but the SB 35 streamlining, they call it, for these multifamily projects, it's not available in certain areas. And there's a lengthy list in the state law of areas where it's not available. Things like in earthquake fault zones, or very high fire hazard severity zones and floodplains and things like that. But assuming that the project is not in one of these areas where it's just maybe dangerous to build, SB 35 would apply to qualifying projects. And the result is pretty simple and straightforward. It can only be subjected to a ministerial approval based on objective standards. And that's one reason why many cities have, in the last few years, become very interested in developing, in fleshing out their objective standards, or almost converting from subjective to objective standards. And just for anybody who's listening that might want to understand that difference a little better, subjective standards are standards where compliance is determined based on the individual, based on the opinion of the decision maker. Things like reasonable, harmonious, compatible, appropriate, those kind of words all beg for personal opinion, which historically has been fine. That's been part of the decision-making process, but to an increasing degree under recent housing laws and the current trend in the housing law, cities are increasingly limited in their ability to subject housing projects in particular to subjective standards. So the alternative is objective standards, things that can be measured, things that can be quantified based on readily available standards. So with that in mind, some cities, many cities are looking to develop more robust standards on the objective side to replace or in addition to their subjective standards, which they might not be able to use all the time. Fast forward a little bit to a couple years ago, the legislature passed SB 330. And there are some, we hear a lot of talk about SB 330, but it did a handful of things that are most notable. The first is it created a preliminary application. That was new. The preliminary application allows a developer or an applicant, I should say, with a housing development project, and it borrows that definition from the Housing Accountability Act, which I'll talk about in a second. But an application coming in with a housing development project, and that means either a purely residential project or a mixed use project with at least 2/3 residential, or any transitional or supportive housing. An applicant coming in for a housing development project can now submit a preliminary application long before, up to 6 months before they submit their full application. And that preliminary application, the requirements are all set forth in statute. The city can't require anything else. And they're fairly simple. It kind of boils down to a 2 or 3 page checklist where they check boxes and provide yes or no answers or one-word answers. With the exception of the requirement for fairly detailed site plans and elevations and material choices. The reason why this preliminary application is so significant is because under the SB 330, this new preliminary application gives the applicant early vesting. In other words, they can, just by submitting a preliminary application to the city, long before the city even sees the full application and they get approval and a building permit, long before that point, they lock in the universe of rules that applies to their project. If their project as submitted, as is consistent with all of the applicable objective standards in the general plan and zoning. So if it complies with all the objective standards in the general plan and zoning that were in effect on the day that they handed the city their preliminary application, they lock in the whole universe of rules that apply to their project. That means that any subsequent changes to zoning, to the general plan, to fees, don't apply. So that's a pretty big benefit for developers. And it's a pretty significant change for the city. So once they submit a preliminary application, they have 6 months to submit their full application. And then the city lets them know whether or not their application is complete. And once it is, whether it's once they submit a preliminary application, or maybe they just don't, they don't have to, they can choose to just go straight to a full application. They get that early vesting, and it starts a clock of 60 to 90 days. I think it's 60 to 90, maybe it's 30 to 60 days. In any event, it starts a clock based on the number of units in the project, by which the city must tell them whether or not their project as proposed is consistent with all the objective standards that are on the books at that time. If it's not, then if it's not consistent, then we have to tell them, otherwise it is deemed consistent. So if you've got a height limit of 20 feet, and somebody proposes with a preliminary application to do a project that's 30 feet tall, the city has to tell them within 30, 60, 90 days, whatever it is, that their project doesn't is not consistent with that objective 20-foot standard. And if we don't, then even their 30-foot project is deemed consistent, and we can't deny it or ask them to change it based on that higher standard. So I mention this in some detail because SB 330 really did create kind of an obligation on city staff, in particular, city planning staff, to pay attention to applications as soon as they come in and very quickly identify anything that might be out of sync with the objective standards, and let them know in a timely, relatively soon about that inconsistency, because if we fail to do that, their application is deemed to be consistent and we don't get to come back and ask them to change it.
Todd, I have a question for you. So you indicated that in this ministerial, I can't pronounce it right, pardon me, process, the streamlined process, right? So it comes to the city and the city then reviews it. And since you indicated it's more of an automated check the box thing for the applicant, it behooves the city, whoever's reviewing that application as part of the streamlined process, that all the boxes are checked. So we should have a checklist to ensure whether it be someone, an applicant with under 150 units or over, or if it's under 30 days, under 60, correct?
Mhm.
Okay. I have a question to our city staff. Do we have something like that for this process? Like a checklist to ensure the applicant?
Yeah, we don't yet. That's the purpose of our objective design standards later on today. So we would develop the standards, but part of that is also getting a checklist that we make available for applicants.
Perfect.
That's
Okay.
being developed.
To create transparency with the applicant as well.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you, Todd. Appreciate that.
Absolutely. It's a great question, Commissioner. And to be clear, the preliminary application requirements are in the statute. They're in state law. And anybody today, without waiting for staff to generate their own local copy, can go there, find the checklist, and submit based on that checklist. And staff, if it were to receive a preliminary application today, would do the exact same thing. We would reach for the statute and use that as our checklist. When it comes to the full application, of course, there are the requirements are much more bespoke. They're much more determined by the local city, and the city would have, but for a long time, the city has had the obligation to post its requirements for a full application, and that's underway.
One more thing along this process, can you talk to us a little bit about SECA and the determinations about that? I mean, does it change anything? Remind me again.
Absolutely. Great
thank you.
question. So CEQA, or the California Environmental Quality Act, as we know, is a law that requires decision makers to consider the environmental impacts of what they're approving before they make those decisions. It only applies to discretionary actions. So any of these state housing laws that requires a city to ministerially approve a housing project, by its very definition, it is exempt from any CEQA.
There it is. Okay. So if it meets the requirements, then it just kind of goes, it's like again, streamline that process it goes through.
That's right. If any of these projects that have to be ministerially approved qualify, then CEQA doesn't apply.
Okay. And
Great
what
question.
if there's concerns around anything that falls under that scope, of SECA? Like, is there any objection, or is there any no, just go. That's
No.
it. Okay.
But I will say this, that it's not an exception under CEQA. It's not an exemption or an exception under CEQA itself, but I believe SB 335 does as well. The housing laws generally, and I think these two in particular, have kind of a safety valve, if you will.
Okay, that's the one I want. Yeah, talk to me about that.
There is an option for the city to deny it, what it would otherwise have to approve, if it can make findings that the project would have a specific adverse impact
Mhm.
on It's usually public health and safety, not welfare. So it can't be because it's ugly. It has to be because it's dangerous.
Got it.
And in some contexts, it's not just dangerous to people and property, it could be dangerous to the environment. And that's where we kind of see a little bit of overlap between CEQA and the specific adverse impact finding. And that's there in a lot of housing bills, including SB 9, which you've probably heard about,
Yeah.
the duplex bill. So the great questions. Anything else before I talk about some of the other things that SB 330 does?
I was curious, does this just apply to municipalities or does that also the county under those guidelines?
The county is treated for, of course, in unincorporated county,
Yeah,
right?
incorporate.
That's where it has land use authority. It applies to the county as well.
All across. So are you gonna speak more about the objective design standards or? you're gonna
We
move on?
certainly can. Why don't I touch briefly on some of the other big things that
Perfect.
SB 35 does, and then we'll circle back to this broader idea of objective standards.
you.
A lot of the attention that is given to SB 330 is really because of the early vesting under the Housing Accountability Act that arises with the introduction of this preliminary application. The Housing Accountability Act for years has set this early vesting point in time just based on a complete application. All SB 330 did was kind of introduce this notion of a preliminary application into that existing early vesting framework. And that effectively just gives the developer, the applicant, a much earlier opportunity to get that early vesting. So stepping away from the early vesting, the other notable things that SB 330 does is it creates a 5-hearing limit. And this will be really important for you in your service on this body, because it's not just a public hearing like we're used to thinking about it. The city has to take action, has to approve or disapprove a project at or before the 5th hearing. And hearing is defined really broadly to include any public hearing, any workshop, any study session, any continued meeting counts as a second hearing. Whether or not it's a noticed public hearing, as we're used to thinking about it under the planning and zoning law, that's conducted by the city. What this arguably doesn't include is any public outreach meeting that the applicant might want to conduct on their own. And maybe they invite the city to attend. That's fine. That's not a meeting conducted by the city. But we need to keep that in mind, because especially if we're used to being able to continue our meetings.
Or
You
the
really have
conversation,
to-
correct, Todd? It's more of the conversation in a sequential or in whatever order of the same discussion. I think the limit is 5. Is that correct? 5?
The limit is 5. You can only meet 5 times, and that includes an appeal.
Mm.
So as a practical matter, cities really have 4 to work with, 4 to plan on, because as a practical matter, you need to keep 1 in reserve for an appeal because you don't have any control over whether there's an appeal. So at most, and you know that any project that requires an ordinance is going to need a first and second reading at the council.
Mhm.
So you pretty much have 2 opportunities prior to the council. And I don't know if you have a separate design review board or architecture and landscape committee or anything like that. But any of those subcommittees that would normally review a project, every time they meet, that's a hearing. So you on the planning commission will need to just make sure that you come prepared and you discuss as much, get it all out in in the meeting. If you have to continue it once, assuming that you're the first body to see it, you have kind of 2 to play with. But that's about it. Yeah, that's probably enough, unless you have questions about the 5 hearing limits.
To the other commissioners, I've exhausted my questions. I apologize. There were good
Okay.
questions.
Okay. So, and the way to get it, especially for cities that are used to a kind of a lot more back and forth with the applicant, or even with staff, our best advice to cities now is, if you're sitting on the planning commission or the council, really do your homework ahead of time. Take advantage of the opportunities that you have in one-on-ones with the city manager and staff to ask a lot of your questions before the meeting. You can do that as much as you want. And maybe staff is going to be mad at me for saying this, but call them anytime. I volunteer them. Ask them all your questions before the hearing. Try and get as much out of that, as much of that taken care of as you can before the meeting, so that you don't end up with unresolved questions at the end of a meeting and you're tempted to continue it. Really use the meeting to get the decision made. That's my best advice. The other things that the SB 330 does, and you hear a lot about the no net loss rule, is that it creates actually two no net loss rules. The first one is that a city cannot, I'm going to call it down zoning. It can't reduce the residential development potential in either the general plan or the zoning without concurrently upzoning to make up for the same, for the essentially the same number of units. If you downzone 10 acres by 1 dwelling unit per acre, you've got to make up 10 somewhere else. And there are lots of ways to maybe make up 10.
Todd, I'm going to interject. We actually already had this experience actually in our last commission meeting. So where we had to, we were rezoning and, determining how, the ones at the public hearing. So we had that experience already. We had to shift housing to another place. And so city had a little
Okay.
work. Yeah.
I won't belabor the point then. You're all pros at it.
Not really, but we learned.
Challenges.
We're learning.
Yeah, we're all kind of cutting our teeth on this. It's
Yes.
still fairly fresh. So that's one thing to consider. And now that's legislative changes, right? That's changes to the broadly applicable rules, and not just a change in the zoning or a change in the density of a zone. It might be a change in height, a change in setback that has an indirect impact on the amount of units that can be developed there. So setting that aside, the other no net loss rule, as that SB 330 creates, is project specific. It's not legislative, and it actually prevents the city from approving any new housing development project that eliminates existing housing, unless that same project makes up for those same units. You can't eliminate 10 to build 5, but you can eliminate 10 to build 10 or 20. And so that's kind of the other side of the coin. It's not so much a restraint on city regulation as it is a charge that the city has to ensure that any housing project replaces whatever it might eliminate. And then I guess the other big idea, which ties into the earlier question about objective standards, is SB 330 prohibits a city from adopting any new subjective standard. And again, those are the ones that are kind of opinion-based. The city may not adopt any new subjective standard after, I think it's January 1st, 2020.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a related on the no net loss rule for legislative, you can't reduce the capacity lower anyway than whatever it was on January 1st, 2018, but I don't want to confuse the matter. No new subjective standards after 2019, right? So starting in 2020, we can't have new subjective standards. The law does not erase old subjective standards. So any subjective standard that you have still on the books from before 2020, they're still on the books, they're still valid. Now, for years, decades, the law has limited what a city can do with subjective standards in connection with housing development projects. That's under the Housing Accountability Act, but that hasn't changed with SB 330. SB 330 just says you can't adopt any new subjective standards, but you can see how, especially as we update our general plans, our land use elements, our housing elements, which we're all still freshly, keenly aware of right now, and zoning, anytime we touch any of that, we're likely wanting to change the standards. All new standards have to be objective. So it's it's quantifiable. It's readily ascertainable from generally available standards. So that's kind of where you're left. That's another big reason why cities are generally moving more of their standards to be objective rather than subjective. And I'll say this about objective and subjective standards. When people ask, well, how do we come up with that? We're used to this subjective standard, we're used to thinking about things in terms of harmony and reasonableness and compatibility. I like to invite people to think about, well, what do you usually get as a result of considering these subjective standards in a typical CUP process, for example? Where do you usually end up? And then let's see if we can boil that down to objective standards. And then you're still, in a sense, you're still exercising all that same discretion, but instead of doing it at the end of a project-specific process, you're doing it up front. Mm-hmm. When you're crafting your rules. You still have discretion, I'll say, in terms of what objective standards you adopt. And that can be a comfort sometimes, to know that we're just moving the discretion earlier in the process. We're not losing it. So for what it's worth,
you, Todd. Sorry to interject. I think it provides consistency, and it really does look also for safety, as we're building. So it really looks at a lot of things. So I really appreciate us having something standardized to a certain extent, and having that flexibility for the aesthetic and whatnot. My question to you is going back to what you were speaking of, is how do we level set? So this is part of us learning about, ODS, objective design standards, but where do we start? I'm sure the staff has a presentation or something, but what are some things to consider as we determine and we move forward with adopting, objective design standards? Like where should we look for? What should we be thinking as commissioners? Besides measurable, besides factual, all that good stuff that comes with it.
Well, there are lots of policy considerations, right? What do you, if everybody used these standards, would we like the results?
Okay.
So how big are we comfortable with things getting? How tall? How close to the property line? What kind of maximum, if everybody built to the maximum building envelope, what would we want that building envelope to look like?
Okay. For
single family homes? And now too, as you consider what objective standards you might want, it's wise to think, to take into account the additional by right potential that SB 9 and ADUs provide. Mm-hmm. So when you think about what do we want our single family home neighborhoods, our R1 zone, what do we want that to look like? Well, we need to keep in mind, it's not just going to be one primary dwelling unit there. Potentially, there might be a second primary dwelling unit and an ADU.
Mhm.
And, if there's an urban lot split, you might see that kind of multiply. So thinking about what you want the end result to look like, working backward from that to a building envelope, and that's mostly a quantified, height, width, setback, that kind of thing. In terms of architectural style,
Mhm.
that's a real challenge, I won't lie. It's a real challenge if you want to have opinions about how ugly or how pretty things look.
Yeah.
You're going to have to boil that down to objective standards. Some cities go bonkers with it, and they develop 30-page long lists of objective standards as they try to describe what faux Tuscan style looks like, or Tudor style, or modernist style. And of course, design professionals hate that, right? Because now you're telling them that they have to make everything look the same.
Mhm.
So that's really a policy choice that your body and the council will need to consider, is how much do we want to try to have a say through objective standards about how things end up looking, the style of it. Because before, we could just say it has to be harmonious and reasonable. And then we could reject something, maybe Tudor doesn't fit in a Tuscan neighborhood. You can't really do that now unless you've got an objective standard to work with. That's what I would suggest, is consider what you want things to look like. What is that? Boil that down to building envelope and then style. And, some of the nicer neighborhoods in LA, they didn't dictate style from house to house, and it varies wildly. And they just developed the art of the giant hedge if they didn't want to see their neighbor's house.
Yeah.
So that's one approach. I don't know.
Thank you for that. Commissioners, any questions?
Yeah, it's gonna be a tough one. Aesthetically, everybody has their own interpretation of how, what they like, At mid-century, like you said, Tudor, I mean, the sky's the limit, so, yeah, that's a tough one.
Do you have a checklist for us or something to start with?
Staff
off the
can
shelf?
find a lot of great examples out there already.
Yeah.
The Northern California cities have been very active
Okay.
in this space. I would just crib from whoever you like their work. And some cities go the other way. Instead of trying to dictate what things look like, they focus on what they want things to not look like. So they'll start with saying, you can't have, expanses of flat stucco that are bigger than X square feet without a pop out of at least 6 inches. Or you have to have at least 3 exterior materials on the front of a building, or you can't have any corrugated iron, any corrugated metal as siding. Maybe you don't like stacked stone and you want to prohibit that. I don't know.
Do we have conceptual drawings on the ADUs, Gabe, at this point, in terms of elevations or some conceptual drawings of what because my understanding is that we have 3 units, a 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, and a 3-bedroom that we're gonna offer to the community for free. Is that correct, or?
Yeah, and Todd, just so you know, the city's drafting pre-approved ADU plans. And so that would be made available to the public. So we would pre-approve them. That might be a little bit different than the objective design standards, because we're not necessarily requiring ADUs to exactly look like those 3 types, but it's just making it easier for someone to build it.
We gotta weigh in terms of the conceptual drawings or what the elevation, what they potentially look like, because they're all gonna look the same, I guess. The 1-bedroom, the 2-bedroom, the 3-bedroom, based on whatever neighborhood we put them in.
Yeah, and that's kind of the hard part. It's
That's
like,
the challenge.
even when we do these plans, it's like, what does everyone want? Right? Is it gonna be a Spanish style and modern?
Exactly.
And that's what we're going towards, right? But that's not all there is. There's
I like the
all
Tudor.
kinds of different architecture.
Okay.
Yeah, but
Well, that's nice to hear that that's happening, because the last time I attended a meeting for the city, I think the council was talking about that, about getting some pre-approved plans done. So that's nice to hear that it's gone forward.
Yeah, I know that North County, I've seen that they were pretty active. They got theirs approved, North County, San Diego, so they were offering them. There was some nice, they were basically real simple elevations, but I think the objective was to do them as affordable as possible, you know, all the challenges financially people are going through. So I think that obviously you don't want to build a two-door. You have a bunch of materials, so you want to try to do this and keep the construction costs down.
Did that help to answer the questions that you had about objective standards, or can I do more to help on that?
Yeah, I think you've done a good job. I don't know if we have any questions on some of the other commissioners, but.
Todd, just if you have anything to add, I know the commission will be considering objective design standards today for specifically multifamily housing.
Okay.
And to me, it kind of seems like, well, that's important, right? So whatever you don't put in there, well, that, you know, you might see that, right, in new multifamily development. And so probably means a lot to really review those standards, right? Because that's going to dictate the future development. And some of these projects might not come before the planning commission in the future. That might be over the counter.
Yeah, that's a great point. This is your opportunity to have
Design
an
standards.
opinion.
Maybe you can elaborate a little more on it then. But at least recommendations or stuff that we can look at and make a decision on.
From me or from staff?
From yourself.
Okay. Well, certainly think carefully about the height limit, the setbacks, anything that dictates the articulation, you know, how much the surface of the building has to change, you know, so are you okay with it just being a giant shoebox with flat sides, or do you need some kind of pop out? Think hard about those questions. Changes in the roof line. Think about, especially now, think about privacy concerns. Do we want to restrict where windows can be when properties are so close to others? Do we want to require windows in certain locations to be obscured with frosted glass or something? Of course, well, I already mentioned setbacks, landscaping. You might give careful thought to landscaping requirements, especially when it comes to privacy. You'll, of course, want to think about parking for whatever is appropriate for the city. And that's, if the city has a history of strong opinions about architectural style, either do's or don'ts, it's worth spending the time to come, you know, sort of be real thoughtful about that and bake that into your standards, because as has been mentioned, if they're not in the rule, they won't be a part of it. For many purposes, though, I will say this, that you know, unless it's an SB 35 project or an SB 9 project, one of the big developer complaints about the Housing Accountability Act is that it does not convert those decisions into ministerial decisions. And some subjectivity, if like I said, if the subjective standard is old, it can still be considered. It just can't be used to deny the project or to reduce the number of units. So if somebody comes in and says, I want to do a 10-unit apartment building, you can say, and I want it to look like Tudor style. And you have an old subjective standard on the books that talks about how it needs to be harmonious with the neighborhood, and the neighborhood is all Spanish style. Arguably, you can say, we'll approve your project conditioned on you making it look Spanish and not Tudor. We're not denying the project, and we're not conditioning it in a way that reduces the number of units. So we can still use that old subjective standard. I would not urge you though, I mean, I would urge you to not rely on that, because the general trend has been away from that. And I don't know that we'll have that option much longer under state law. So it's worth taking the time now to think real hard about how do we want things to look in terms of height, setback, articulation, maybe architectural style. Maybe just you want to keep people from doing certain things, like raw cinder blocks might not be popular. I don't know. And bake that into your standards and then live with those standards. I mean, that's what I would say too, is you know, they talk about analysis paralysis. Don't wait. Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Just adopt something that makes sense today or soon, and then live with it and be willing to come back and revisit it. You know, if you find that people are doing things that are ugly out of, you know, particular kind of material, then you can decide later on to prohibit that material. Does that help at all?
Yes,
Todd, add one more question. Like, what if the city went in a lot of detail about architectural style, about just a lot of detail that a housing development would have, where it could be perceived that it's making a development, even like affordable housing development, infeasible? And so is that almost the flip side of having objective design standards, is that you are kind of solidifying a preference from the city that maybe could be costly to develop?
Well, certainly it can be taken to an extreme, which would be more susceptible to challenge, right? Like if we said, we really like Donald Trump and how he does his bathrooms, we want to make everything in our bathrooms gold plated. That's a new objective standard. Every bathroom fixture has to be gold plated. That's unlikely to be sustained, maybe just because there's no rational basis for it. I'm just trying to think of an example that would be kind of absurd. But in general, your objective standards, as long as they're not absurd, will be upheld, because there are already, the law already provides tools to get relief from standards that make units, especially affordable units, infeasible. And chief among them is the density bonus law, which, as you probably already know, if a project comes in with a certain amount of affordable units, they have a right to certain concessions, incentives, and waivers of standards. And we see this a lot. In fact, just this afternoon, I was helping another client with that, where they wanted relief from a height restriction because they had 20% affordable units. And so the law provides these mechanisms for people to get relief, so that the objective standards that the city adopts don't make that affordable housing in particular infeasible. And then, of course, the housing element law itself requires cities to continually scrutinize their own rules to see if they have any rules that are that amount to an unlawful constraint on the development of needed housing. And so I'll just say this: do what you think is best in terms of what objective standards should be, and you'll find out eventually if somebody thinks that it's too constraining for housing to be feasible, and then you can revisit the question.
Here, just to let you know, there was 3 minutes till 6.
Okay, thank you, Todd, so much. Very informative. Really appreciate your presentation. And definitely reach out to you with more questions.
Fair enough. And I do apologize for not having a pretty PowerPoint. I just thought it might be more helpful to talk.
That was perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Todd.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Mhm. So getting back to our regular commission meeting.
I would just adjourn the
Okay,
study session
Okay, so
and then you'll,
make a motion to adjourn the study session.
and you have 2 minutes, so you'll need to start the meeting at 6 or after that, first 6.
Okay,
A motion to adjourn.
that's it.
Motion.
Do I get a second or?
I second that.
Get a roll
That
call?
was Commissioner Murillo.
Yes, sir.
Okay, Commissioner Ramirez,
Yes.
Commissioner Murillo,
Yes.
Commissioner Arvizo,
Yes.
and Chair Gonzalez.
Yes. Going on, next item, roll call. Can I get roll call? Okay.
Commissioner Arvizo,
Present.
Commissioner Murillo,
Present.
Commissioner Ramirez,
Present.
alternate Commissioner Fonseca, absent, Vice Chair Hernandez, absent, and Chair Gonzalez.
Present. Okay, going on to the next item, approve the agenda. At this time, the commission may announce any item being pulled from the agenda or continue to another date or request the moving of an item on the agenda.
Commissioner, I think I saw something on item 5 to table this item. Is that accurate, staff?
Yeah, that would be, if you want to bring it up now and then just already table it, it's going to be a quick action, so.
Okay, is that's item number,
5. Item number 5 about the airport business park.
okay, then we have the other one too, isn't it? Isn't the,
There's no other items being tabled.
okay, all right. That's the one I probably read. Okay, approval of the minutes. Planning Commission meeting, June 2023. A motion for the minutes.
Motion to approve the meeting minutes. I didn't find any issues. I'll second that.
Second, you get roll call today.
And that was Commissioner Arvizo, the second.
Yes.
Commissioner Arvizo,
Yes.
Commissioner Murillo,
Yes.
Commissioner Ramirez,
Yes.
and Chair Gonzalez.
Yes.
Motion passes.
Okay, next item, written communication. You have anything?
No written communication from staff.
Okay, moving on to the next item, public comments, non-agenda items. The public may address the commission on any item of interest to the public that is not on the agenda, but is within the subject matter jurisdiction thereof. Please limit your comments to 3 minutes. You have any comments?
If there are anybody on Zoom, if you want to raise your hand, if you'd like to talk. I do not see any.
Okay. Closing public comments. Moving on to reports and requests.
No reports and requests from staff.
Okay, we're going on to non-hearing items. Public hearing calendar, ways of judicial. City of Coachella objective design standards for multifamily residential and mixed-use development. Zoning ordinance amendment number 20-04 is a proposal to amend Coachella Municipal Code Title 17 zoning, adopting objective design standards for multifamily residential developments to apply to GN General Neighborhood, UN Urban Neighborhoods, PT-PB Downtown Pueblo Viejo, PT-PB Transition UE Urban Employment and Neighborhood Commercial Zone City Initiative.
Okay, thank you, Chair Planning Commission. And Jason, just want to let you know, we do have a presenter on this in the audience, and his name is Don. So he will be presenting the item. And let's just check, he may want to share his screen for the presentation. Hi, Don, I don't know if you can hear me. Okay, looks like he's still attendee. Okay. Hi, Don. I'm not sure if you're going to want to share your screen before I maybe after I give a background. Okay. So commissioners, I'll give you a background on this. This item before you today is the objective design standards for multifamily housing and mixed-use development. As we had the study session earlier, there is some housing law that has been passed in 2017 that kind of restricts the ability of cities to apply subjective standards in the review of residential development. So if it's anything like guidelines, so we have downtown Pueblo Viejo guidelines, and if they're just guidelines and they're not measurable or verifiable or haven't been adopted, in the municipal code or by ordinance, it's very difficult to apply those standards to new development. So the state law requires them to be objective. And so the city did apply for grant funding through SCAG to create those objective design standards for multifamily housing and mixed-use development. We have been working with the consultant Randall Arambula, and they are planning design consultant out of Portland, Oregon. They have been assisting other cities that also applied for the similar funding. That includes the cities of Newport Beach, Westminster, the city of Grand Terrace. So they're all going through this process of having this reviewed by their planning commission and city council. So this process has been about 18 months working with the applicant, sharing our design guidelines, sharing what we have in the zoning code, and identifying, what's important that we think from staff in the development of those objective design standards. We did have some public meetings that we did notify Planning Commission about to get some input from the community as well as stakeholders. So builders that regularly build multifamily housing. We did get some comments that were included in your staff report that we will go over later after the presentation. This is a pretty important document. So, we can spend as much time as we need to on this, but the consultant will present what is presented for Planning Commission and City Council for adoption. So this will impact how multifamily and mixed use development is reviewed in the future. So I'll pass it on to Don, see if Don is able to speak at this time. Don, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you just fine.
Okay, great. Hey, that was a great introduction, Gabriel. And if you just bear with me, can everybody see the screen? They should say agenda up on the screen.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to do this 20 minutes. I may actually take a little bit longer since you are the Planning Commission, and you probably may want to get into the weeds a bit. What I'd like to do is give the presentation and then come back, and if you have any clarification questions, ask them then. So I'd only ask you to hold a question unless it's something dire that you need to interrupt me, but I'll try to move through this fairly quickly. Is that all right with everybody? Okay. All right. So I know you just had a discussion with Todd, and some of this stuff is going to kind of revisit some of that again. And so I just wanted to summarize that the work that we're doing specifically to multifamily objective design standards. And so the state legislature is requiring all cities to come up with objective design standards. And there's really the idea is to superheat the production of multifamily housing, since we have a housing crisis in the state of California. And there's a couple of ways that can be done. The first piece of this is adopting objective development standards, essentially defining the rules of the game. So it's clear how you would get a project approved, and then faster permitting. So if you qualify for all the requirements under SB 30, 330, and 335, you get faster permitting. So this really is two key pieces that the legislature wants to see come out of this. And the problem is right now is that you've got objective, you don't have any ODS right now. And the idea here is to replace your design guidelines that are ambiguous and unclear. They have a lot of subjectivity, they're inconsistent in their interpretations. And as a result of that, they prolong the review process, and this is a problem. It becomes a he said versus she said sort of instance, because they're simply recommendations, not requirements. Oops, just coming back to this. We've got a little bit of jump here. Bear with me here. I'm getting a little jumpy with my presentation. Okay, so the idea is the objective design standards will be predictable. They will include no gray area interpretation. And then again, I'm repeating some of the things that you just talked about. Their requirements, shalls or musts, that are verifiable as opposed to recommendations. And they're measurable. So you'll have dimensions, you'll have heights, you'll have widths, those sorts of requirements that you can measure. So that's a big deal to come out of these with ODS to do that. And as a result of this, the second piece of this is that it will be ministerial review by city planning staff, not by the Planning Commission or City Council. So that's another key component of this. So the standards will apply to the areas that you've just gone through your general plan update for mixed use apartment development in the downtown urban employment and neighborhood center areas. Apartment and townhome development in urban neighborhoods and general and the urban neighborhood and general neighborhood areas. And objective standards will not apply for suburban neighborhood areas or any sort of remodel projects. This is all for new construction. As part of the staff review, as I mentioned, there will be no review by Planning Commission or City Council, and it will require submittal of a SB 330 application and a supplemental SB 35 application if somebody approves. It meets the qualifications for that application. This doesn't mean if somebody wants to go through your existing architectural review process, they can do it. They can opt out of this. So this is for those developers that want to take advantage of this objective development standards process and a streamlined review timeline that's done by staff rather than by the Planning Commission. So what are the benefits for the developers? Well, if you go through this process and you've got a streamlined application for 150 units or less, it would be required by state law 90 days. If it's more than 150 units, it's 180 days. And if you qualify for SB 35, you would be exempt from CEQA review. So that would be an additional benefit. For city residents, the outcomes of this ends up being that you're going to have a higher supply of housing that comes online much quicker. Through the development of the ODS, the standards can reflect the community's values in terms of building design. Secondly, we can identify things that will make the city better along the edges. Things like sidewalks and plazas that are amenities that would be constructed and maintained by the developers. So those are things that people would benefit from, even if you don't live in a multifamily development project. And because these apply to mixed use developments, you will find that you will get more opportunities for shopping if you have shops in the ground floor, for example. So let's talk a little bit about the objective design standards content. And the objective design standards will regulate 3 areas. And you see the little cartoons on the left. The public realm, that's another term for sidewalks and landscaping that's adjacent to it. So it's kind of the edge or the collar around a development project. So you see that yellow, that's that public edge. And typically we say that's probably the most important thing to get right, because that's where most of the people of Coachella are going to interact with a multifamily project. And so we believe that this has mutual benefits for the residents and the general public. So it's really important to get this piece right. The second chapter, if you will, or section of the ODS will be site development standards. The horizontal surfaces of a site that go from property line to property line, front, side, and rear setbacks. And then the third component of it will be the building design, the vertical elements, the building itself, and how that building is designed. So the ODS, starting with the public realm improvements, let's just go over what we'd like to see. And when we talk about those perimeter streetscape standards, the standards are going to identify things that include widened sidewalks, canopy street trees, shrubs and ground cover, ornamental lighting, benches, and bike racks. Now, every type of development may not include those, but this is kind of the laundry list of things that the public realm improvements can or may include. And one of the reasons that we want to see these improvements is many of your development sites, a lot of them in your general plan, occur on your major roadways where you have a high volume of traffic. And these are places where we want to address pedestrian safety and comfort. Keep in mind, many people who live in your multifamily projects may be transit dependent. That is that they may not own a car, they may have children who attend a nearby school, and they may want to walk to services, a doctor, a grocery store. And those are important sorts of not simply amenities, but requirements for people who are living here. So we need to be able to take care of these in a way that makes those trips for those residents and the community at large better. So what do we want to talk about the standards? So there's really two areas that we want to talk about. Development that occurs along busy streets. And these streets generally have higher traffic volumes and they're wider in width. So these generally are classified in your general plan as major arterials, primary arterials, and collector streets. So what would we like to see? And what is really the intent of the standards, knowing that they're on these busy streets? The idea is to provide some sort of buffer between the walking areas and that high volumes of traffic, because many of these streets can have 30, 40, even greater average daily trips a day at high speeds. So it's not only safe, but it's more comfortable if there's a separation, and that will encourage more walking. And so what we'd like to see is not the example on the left where the sidewalk is attached to the curb, but a separation with landscaping as that buffer. So some standards have been developed, and the standards talk about zones. So zones within that area. There's a standard for parkway zone, the sidewalk itself, and something that we're calling a transition zone, that area between the sidewalk and the building envelope, what we're calling the public realm line, where the closest any sort of development that's adjacent within the site can encroach to. So in this instance, in many instances, we believe that a public easement will be required. And as part of this, I think as you start thinking about updating any zoning codes, we would request that you think about a quid pro quo, where if you're asking for a public easement, you grant the developer to have a shallower setback.
Don, I have a question. Thank you, Chairman.
Don, did we have some questions in between? We have some of the commissioners that have some questions that would like to interact in the presentation.
I'm fine with that. If you've got it, it's something that's relevant to where we're at in the presentation.
Yeah,
Yeah, so it's related to the sidewalks and, creating that, the safety component. I did not notice in your presentation anything about ADA compliance, like for those who are, who have a chair, a wheelchair, or motorized chair. I'm just curious about that. Is there any consideration in objective design standards for those considerations for ADA compliance?
Well, that's actually a central component of the sidewalk zone. So when we review the requirements, the sidewalk zone will say it's got to have ADA compliant width, which is no less than 6 feet that we see here, and there are no obstructions within that zone. So what we don't want to see are poles and signs. We don't want to see traffic control boxes. We want to see this area clear of any of those obstructions. And so the value of having this PKZ zone, the parkway zone, is that's where those sorts of signs that regulate traffic, where you have roadway lighting, that can occur there. And so that's really the intent of keeping that out of the sidewalk zone.
yeah, thank you, Don. Yeah, that's all ADA compliance. It's
Okay.
needed anyway, so
Thank you.
they have to abide by those standards.
Thank you, Chairman.
Okay.
Thank
So,
you.
so these are really for the busy streets, the places where if you're handicapped or a child, you'll be comfortable walking. The kind of place, if you were a mother, you would say, son, go to the grocery store, and you would feel comfortable in asking them to do that because you feel like the sidewalk is safe. Okay, so let's talk about the quiet streets, because These are your streets that are a collector, suburban, residential, urban cul-de-sac as streets. So this is generally, for a collector street, any street that has less than 15,000 average daily trips a day. It's kind of a cutoff line that we've identified in other cities around the country. So it would be a street that you see in this image. What I do know right now is part of your existing general plan, this is a rare occurrence. There are not a lot of streets where you've designated multifamily housing that are on these type of streets. That doesn't mean you couldn't rezone and add more, but we wanted to provide you with a standard for these quieter streets. So what we have, again, is the same sort of condition that we prefer not to see, largely because of the comment that you made about ADA compliance. So we do not want to see curb adjacent sidewalks that you see on the left, that we would like to see a landscape buffer area. So that clear zone for the sidewalk up the middle. And then another consideration of this, because these are lower traffic streets, in terms of the development, we'd like to see front doors fronting onto these streets with sidewalks connecting it. So we want to make sure that these are comfortable for direct access to residences that we would see along this. So we've got the similar sort of zones that we've developed for this quieter streets. There was a parkway zone, there's a sidewalk zone, and a transition zone. The difference is because these are quieter streets, we're asking for a narrower parkway zone. So this would be simply just 4 feet in width as opposed to a wider parkway zone that you saw in the earlier graphic. Right. So then the next piece that we want to talk about is what we're calling the public realm transition. So let me just go back to this previous graphic. So you see this transition zone. So we're interested in the face of this building. The ground floor, if you can see that little hand, we're concerned mostly about the ground floor, but we're also concerned about the upper floors and what that character is along that street edge. So we want to have standards for the first floor residential and first floor commercial uses that engage that sidewalk. So this is really what the following standards are going to talk about. So we want to think about these in two things. We want to talk about privacy, especially at the ground floor, and we want to talk about livability. So we're going to have standards that talk about what occurs along that edge. So as you can see, what we're thinking about is that ground floor. So we've got some standards, especially on busy streets, that we're suggesting that you require a setback if you want to have things like a patio. So this is one option. So there's a whole menu of these. We've got a busy street where you can set the building back, but the upper floors that you can see on the left picture in this illustration of this photograph would be built up to that build-to line, the public realm line, or the property line, so that they don't lose development capacity on the upper floors, but the ground floor is set back for privacy and to create that extra separation between that busy roadway. The second option would be simply to have landscaping. So it wouldn't necessarily have to cantilever over it. It could be simply just landscaping within that setback. And there's a standard that has been identified for that. So we'll get into the weeds of that, but that would be included as well. And you can see another example of what that would be. We would also then talk about a standard that would require above grade conditions. So you could have a setback, stairs and doors and stoops, or in some instances, the developer would be allowed to bring a building right up to the property line, build-to line, if they raise the finished floor. And the rationale for this is that if you have units at that sidewalk at grade, people can peer into windows. So imagine the two women standing in this image. If you had a at grade unit, they could look right into the window. By raising the grade, you give that separation for privacy, and there's a bit of noise attenuation as well by going up, but it's mostly about privacy by raising that finish floor above grade. So this is three options that a developer could do. So we're not prescribing one or the other, but it gives them flexibility to design the site that works best for them if they meet these conditions. So we have also got some standards that deal with first floor commercial uses, because many of your districts permit multifamily if they have a ground floor commercial condition. In this case, we'd like to see the opportunity or allow a developer to bring a building right up to the public realm, the sidewalk, so that you have that integration or the ability for people walking along the sidewalks to enter front doors or have dining, outdoor seating within that public realm. So this creates the condition that would have that more pedestrian orientation to it. That would look something like this. Now, that doesn't mean that they couldn't set it back and have plazas and promenades and courtyards that you see on the right if they choose to do that. But it gives them the flexibility to do either condition. So that's the public realm improvements. So let's talk about the site design. So that from property line, the public realm, to the side yard, the rear yard, and the site design conditions. And so what we want to have are some standards that deal with landscaping. So generally, we want to ensure that they're water efficient and they're desert compatible, the landscaping. The intent of the landscaping is to unify multiple buildings if you've got more than one on a development site. The landscape needs to enhance the enjoyment of the beauty of public and private spaces. A key one is provide visual screening, especially of parking. And then think about the climate, shade and sun, shelter from the wind as well. We've got standards that we'll talk about outdoor lighting. So what we want to do is ensure that you have safe conditions. We want to make sure that if you're having plazas or open spaces, they're animated with lighting. And probably most importantly, we want to make sure that lighting doesn't create any unnecessary nuisance for adjacent development sites or neighbors. So their standards talk about shielding lighting or directing lighting away from development areas. There are also standards for utilities. We want to make sure that the utilities work for a development site, but they do not detract from the visual quality of the public realm or facades. So we want to see them screened generally. Most of all, we'd like to see, if we're feasible, the utilities underground. There's standards also for walls, fences, and gates. So what we want to have is standards that are for walls, fences along parking lots as a buffer between adjacent development. We want to have standards that provide first floor resident unit privacy through patio walls, and then walls for common areas. So there's standards that define the character, height, width, and the materials that go along with those walls, fences, and gates. Finally, the final chapter or section of the ODS is the building design. So the structure is size. So what we're offering here is a menu of 3 options. There's option 1 and 2, and they're largely based on the architectural styles that are commonly found in the Coachella Valley. Now, the standards are not prescribing specific architecture, but but they're really describing the types of forms and massing and materials that typically occur with these types of buildings. So while it's not literal in Spanish colonial or mid-century modern type of architecture that you see in these two pieces, it's really extracting really the general feel and look of those buildings, but allowing enough flexibility for an architect and to developer to propose something that may not be exactly this, but still is compatible and is a good neighbor with any of the styles of architecture that currently occur within Coachella. So what we want to do first and most is talk about the form and massing of the building to reduce the building's scale, the perceived size and presence in relationship to its existing setting, as I mentioned, to be a good neighbor. And then the massing, the overall volume of the structure. Building should be generally be not perceived as a long or especially tall building, but a series of structures that is broken up horizontally and vertically. So let's talk about building modulation. So that form and massing of the building is what modulation is. So the first option applies to buildings that are 3 and 4 story in height. And the examples that you see in the graphics, for your knowledge, these are all affordable housing projects. So it's something, when you think about viability, yes, you can do these for affordable housing projects or mixed use projects that have an affordable component within them. So the standards are going to only apply where the minimum density is 20 dwelling units an acre. So this won't apply to duplexes, triplexes, townhomes that are less than 20 dwelling units an acre. It will also apply only to general neighborhood, and urban employment zones. So that's kind of the requirements that you have in terms of development standards and uses. So let's talk about vertical modulation. So this is regulating and modulating the vertical height of a building. And so what we'd like to see is a asymmetrically irregular step variations in building height. So it's not cookie cutter, same height stepping along a facade, but it is stepped, as you see in these the graphics on the left. It includes, as I mentioned before, it includes for standards for buildings that are 3 or 4 stories in height. So here's a standard that you have that includes a minimum of 3 facades in height. 75% of these would be the total area that you could require for only one height. And then you see the other 2 requirements for heights for 2 and 3. So the key piece of this is that we want to make sure that it's viable for development. It also requires some vertical modulation to get that variation. So this is the minimum requirements. There's nothing to say that a developer could do more than this, but at a minimum, we'd like to see this occur. The second piece of this is horizontal modulation. So this really talks about the building facade, pushing the building in and out through recesses and projections of facade. And this is really not about building articulation, about balconies or bays, but the overall form and mass of the structure in itself. Now, we would anticipate, and we really encourage things like balconies and bays, but we want to make sure the form and the massing of the building is recessed or projected, so we don't have one flat facade and only the balconies or bays. So it's really pushing the building in and out. So the standards then look at these. So we want to see a minimum of 25% of the facade modulated in or out with recesses of projection. We've got standards that talk about the minimum width and the number of these modulations. So we want to have some, but we don't want the facades to be overly busy, because sometimes less can be more. And then we also want to make sure that if you've got a modulation of recesses and projections, it's meaningful. So there are standards that regulate the minimum depth of those. So you can see how that would be regulated. Finally, in terms of option one, we'd like to talk about roof forms and materials. So generally, we want to encourage very sloped roofs, but understand that there will be flat roofs as well, so that there are percentages that are required for slopes and types of slope roofs. So what we're suggesting is that you would have, for any building, 60% of all roofs should be sloped. Now, for this option one, keep in mind this is option one. You would allow some flat roofs, but they would require a parapet or a mansard screen so that they appear to be sloped from the street level. So that's the first option. So the second option is very similar to the first option, but this option really regulates and provides guidance and modulation for lower density development, those units that are 20 units an acre or less. So this would be your townhomes, duplexes, triplexes that are 2 stories or less. And you see the zoning districts that your general plan is identified for those areas. So like the other, and I'll go through this one a little quicker, it will also have step facades, so that asymmetrically arranged or regular variations is something that is proposed. And we would also like to see some requirements that are measurable and verifiable with these in terms of that variation. So we're suggesting that the 80% of the primary facade would have a uniform height, but the other 20% would need to be stepped at a minimum of 5 feet lower or higher. So this regulates the facade height and not necessarily the roof height. So this is making sure that you have the stepping of this facade, not just simply changing roof heights to meet a vertical modulation requirement. So the second piece of this is horizontal modulation. So these standards talk about, again, the recesses and projections. And here, this is a little bit less than option one. There's only a minimum of 3 as opposed to 4 required facade projections or recesses. And the percentage is only 25%. The depths are fairly similar, that we'd like to see a minimum of 10 feet. 6 feet, and the width a minimum of 10 feet. And these are all based on building typologies. So this works for a townhome or duplex or triplex that you see in these images. So here's it in graphic in the standards. So this is a quick look at that. And you see those requirements that are part of that horizontal modulation in terms of those projections and recesses. Also, there are standards for roof forms and materials in terms of the silhouette that we talked about before. And then finally, we want to be able to talk about the last option. So this is much more of a simpler a building that is really more in line with the desert modernist tradition of the Coachella Valley. So this is more straightforward and has more of a horizontal orientation to it. So these standards, unlike option 1 and 2, would apply to both development that is greater than 20 dwelling units an acre or less than 20 dwelling units an acre. So there's no minimum or maximum density for multifamily development. So the vertical modulation includes step facades as well, as you can see in the illustration. But we do not want to overdo it. So we do want to make sure that there's some stepping, that we want to make sure that it is minimized. So we want to make sure that we've got a primary facade that composes 80% of that facade, but allow some variation for stepping as needed. And this also helps if you have an account for variations in density. So you can have taller buildings and shorter buildings as part of this modulation. Horizontally, we would also have the sort of ins and outs, the recesses and projections that are regulated as well, as you see in these images, very simple buildings. And the idea here is to do the minimum variation, the widths that you see in 10 feet, and the depths as well. So these are all regulated in similar fashion, just the numbers and the widths and the heights and other things are all a little bit different. So those are all the standards. So I'm going to pause right here because I want to go through the approval process right now. But if you have any questions right now, I think maybe it's a good point to ask about those standards now. And then I'm going to go and talk to you a little bit about the approval processes. Questions about these?
I have a question. So going back to your slide, I think it was 39, it was regarding about 20 units per acre. So let's say I'm an applicant, I have 20, I have an acre, I want 20 units in that space. As long as it's only 20 units, it's a mixed use zone, I can put stores underneath those 20 dwellings, correct? Those units? Or I can do 10 and 10, and then the first floor would be storefront, let's say restaurant, store, whatever. Can I do that?
Yes, you could. That's permitted.
Okay, and then I can go as high as 3 floors, or depending on the zone, of course, in the area, but so just wanted to check on that.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you.
And so, and what these objective design standards aren't changing any of your existing or proposed, or any of your existing heights, setbacks, or FARs. Now, if you wanted to change those, you certainly could, but the way these objective development standards have been set up, they're fitting those existing development standards. So keep in mind, these are design standards, not the development standards that you have in your existing code today in terms of densities, heights, setbacks, and FAR. Is that clear?
Yes, and then in addition to my question, architectural review, is that separate from ODS?
For projects that qualify for an SB 330 or SB 335, those would be ministerial.
Got it, yes.
They would be reviewed by staff only. Now, a developer, if they choose not to go through the ODS track, they would go through the existing architectural review process that would be reviewed by the Planning Commission and City Council if needed.
Thank you, Don. I appreciate the feedback.
Don, I also have a question, and thank you for your presentation. My question is, obviously, we're developing standards at the moment. As a city, have we thought about, or there's a plan in place, if and when these plans do pass, what would be with what has already built? What would that fall back on the city to make those improvements, especially like the sidewalks and many of the other things that might not be part of the architectural framework of what's already been built? How would that work retroactively with the city or with the builders or the community or as taxpayers? How would we go back to redesign some of those items that need to be redesigned if this is approved?
So this doesn't change any existing development, but one of the concerns is how do you transition from, let's say you've got a development that has a curb adjacent sidewalk to it, and now the standard has a separated. What you don't want to have is a dead end sidewalk that they don't match up. So the standards really talk about a transition zone that anticipates that you're going to have many conditions where it's not the same as what's being proposed for these multifamily development standards. What we would like to see, though, is over time that your engineering and public works standards that are amended so that they are in line with these standards. so that you have a consistent application, whether it's a multifamily affordable project, a market rate project, a commercial project, or any other type of project that front the streets. So the request would be to Planning Commission is that you would engage your engineering and public works department to review and maybe update your standards for those other conditions. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, Don. Nice presentation. Question addressed at Gabriel. Do we have a criteria, Gabriel, already in place in terms of what our standards are as a city?
We don't, so I'll give you a good example. So there's 3 areas that he talked about in the presentation: the public realm, which is the public area, the site design, right, which is the private property, and then the building. So in the public realm, we don't have standards for that. We do have some general plan policies, but those aren't reflected in our municipal code. So you might recall, like in this development, particularly Pueblo Viejo Villas, he provided an example where it was the curb adjacent sidewalk. Now the developer chose to maintain that curb adjacent sidewalk because it was there, right? So it was cheaper for them to maintain it, but it still, creates a situation where it may not be the safest walking condition if you're walking along Cesar Chavez Street, right? Because you have a lot of traffic there. And it's probably a weird feeling walking on that sidewalk if you don't have some kind of buffer. In the public realm standards, it talks about shade as well, right? Shade trees, and it has a certain percentage of canopy cover and how far they're spaced. We don't have anything like that. They're just in Pueblo Viejo, in our revitalization plan, there are guidelines. So we couldn't, for the AAA development, we couldn't tell them to apply it because they're guidelines, right? What this would put in place is the standards. And so new projects would have to plan ahead with those standards in mind.
I think that buffer is the ideal scenario because it's a public safety issue. Because you have that buffer in between the walkway and actually the roadway. So can we make that as part of one of the conditions that they have to abide by that, or?
Well, if the plan commission recommends approval of this to council and the council approves it, it will be the standard.
Okay, perfect.
Moving forward for any development here.
No, it would be this is anything that's under SB 30, 330 and 335.
Well,
Right.
it will be for anything under SB 330 that might be administrative review, but it will apply to any multifamily housing. So if there's multifamily housing that doesn't qualify for ministerial review, which is staff review,
Yeah, that's,
and it has to go to planning commission would be applying those objective design standards, right? What you wouldn't be able to do is say, you know what, I like how this building looks across the street. I want you to kind of match what they did there. You wouldn't be able to do that anymore. You would have to go specifically by the objective design standards.
However, this doesn't qualify for people that are remodeling their existing homes, correct?
Right,
Okay.
yeah. And so,
Yeah, new
and this is multifamily, right? And so in most cases, if you're referencing single family, it wouldn't apply. to
Yeah,
them.
suburbs and other places as he indicated.
So- yeah, so how do we enforce the guidelines then if they're all gonna be different based on on the new SB laws?
Well, we wouldn't be using guidelines anymore, but we would be using the standards that are presented here and then the staff report. So those would become part of the zoning code. And then we would apply it. So when we take a project to the plan commission, if there's a project that comes before the plan commission that's multifamily or mixed use, we would say, hey, it complies with these standards and these standards, and it doesn't comply with these. So it would be our responsibility as staff to say
Cover
how they
those.
comply, right? We're not going to let or inconvenience the plan commission to figure all that out, right? We're going to try to present that for the plan commission.
Yeah, because you're gonna be doing it in-house.
And they do that already, but this will help expedite per, like, the regulation, SB 330 and 335. It will help expedite.
The type of-
Exactly, and it's already on the applicant to sign off and check off on all those things, submit all the requirements in advance per law. So then this, our staff would be there, be our QC or quality control to check off, oh, they submitted everything, then the applicant can then, move on with their projects already with these set guidelines for these types of dwellings, correct? For these zones as well, like mixed use and whatnot, so, and multifamily,
Mhm.
correct, Gabriel?
Correct, yeah. So a lot of projects, we haven't seen any SB 330, SB 35 projects. Because under state law, a lot of those projects need to apply prevailing wage to their development, so the applicant has to do that. So a lot of applicants that we've seen develop in the city have done their projects without prevailing wage, and they try to avoid that because then the construction costs are really high. So we haven't seen that happen. I'm not sure, what cities experience more of those projects. I'm assuming they're more in the higher density areas of California. So we haven't seen it. Go ahead, Don.
It's more the affluent communities that you're seeing that in. It's the Santa Monica or a Bay Area city. That's where it's happening.
So it could happen here more at one point. So this is a way to be able to have those standards on the books, because the Plan Commission is giving up their power to review a project under, well, you're not giving it up, but the state law is taking it away from you and saying, staff, you're going to review it according to these standards. But at the same time, we are developing those standards so that projects like Pueblo Villas or other multifamily projects, like you could say, here's the standard. This is not a guideline. We're not just suggesting that you should do this. You're required to do it.
Because at the moment, Director, that's negotiable, right? That's still, there's a lot of gray area. With this, the gray area is very, very small, right? Or even non-existent at the
Right.
moment, or for certain, so if you wish to kind of share with me, so at this point, what could a developer like have to negotiate, right? Is there something that we may not be covering at this point that they might still have a big gray area? I'm just thinking hypothetically, could there still be some areas where when I guess to a point, as Commissioner Ramirez was saying, is you're expediting so that when something comes to the commission, it's pretty much going to be approved because it's already kind of, all the checks are done, right?
Yeah, and it would be good to hear some feedback from Don. I did outline a few things that I looked at from other cities that have adopted objective design standards. And I think some of them went a little bit like pretty far, right? They're like, hey, the roof tile needs to look like this, it needs to be like boosted, and I forgot some of the other examples I had brought up.
Right,
Okay.
horribles and other things like that. So
Yeah.
I think the key is take this, one of the attorney talked about, you need to adopt something right now. And you can always add things later. I think the danger is trying to get the perfect set of standards out at the get-go, okay? And you're better off regulating what we say, regulate what matters and allow flexibility if it doesn't matter. And so I think what we've tried to do with the objective development design standards is to identify the key things and provide some flexibility for innovation and change. Because you can't anticipate anything all the time. But if you start seeing patterns over the next couple of years and you say, I'm just not liking this, or I want more of this, you can always amend this and add to it.
So is the, and again, my brain, obviously. So is the city's goal to become like for those of you who may, like a Santa Fe, New Mexico, where there's certain areas that, you walk in there and everything looks the same? I mean, that everything is, like Adobe, like Adobe houses and like this, Southwest, thank you, Chair. And, like I've been to that city and like there's like this area where like everything, as part of their city project, that everything kind of looks, uniformity, right? Is that the goal of the city, or to look that way, or just to look that way and
So
multifamily.
these standards are not agnostic to any architectural style.
Agnostic.
That doesn't mean if it's the will of your community, the planning commission and the city, if you want to start adding what's called prescriptive standards in terms of materials and finishes and styles, you could do that. But in terms of getting affordable housing projects, the sense is, because this is what this is intended to do, is that might be a bridge too far.
Mhm.
And so these are really extracting the characteristics of those styles, but not prescribing them specifically. So it's meeting the intent, but not prescribing it. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
And then I have a question, Gabriel, for the staff, going back to this ministerial review and process. Who would be reviewing this? Who is the team that reviews these forms? Let's say if there's an applicant that submits this form, who would be that person?
It would be me, it would be
So it'd be a
Adrian,
team,
or someone
right?
on planning staff.
Okay, thank you. And would this at any point come as a consent item for us to know who submitted to the planning commission, even though it doesn't come to us, just as a consent item? I would love to
Yeah,
know.
we could always report what's coming into,
I would love
planning.
to know if we get any applicants under
Yeah.
this.
yeah, that's something we could do.
So I've got some additional slides. If you guys don't mind, I can show those to you in terms of the approval process, because I think this will be helpful for you to know that how Gabriel and staff would go about doing it. And if you're going to use the ODS for other multifamily projects, what would be anticipated in terms of what needs to be submitted and how you would go about doing reviewing a project. Because what you want to be able to do is have a universal requirements of submittal elements and reviewing the projects that is done the same way for every project so that it doesn't go sideways on you. So if you don't mind, I could show you some more slides for that if you got time.
Yeah, go ahead, Don.
So I'm going to skip over this because you've had enough talk about these forms. So there is a preliminary application form. So we've reinterpreted this. This is a state form, and this would be handed out at a pre-application conference. So the applicant would get this, and they need to fill this all, and they need to be compliant with everything. It's not a pass. It's a purely a pass-fail. It's not 90% or 80%. You got to meet all the requirements of the SB 330 preliminary application. There's also a SB 35 application form as well. And so we've delivered these to Gabriel so you can take a look at these. So again, this is a pass-fail. You got to do them all. Or you don't qualify. All right. So once you get into the ministerial review process, again, this could, as Gabriel said, this could also be used for a planning commission for projects that are not meeting those requirements. You would have an evaluation form. So this would be something the applicant would fill out, and it would have the basic information about who the applicant is, who the property owner is, and basic project information. What's the density? What's the zone? All those sorts of things that you would typically have. So you'd see it all at a glance. And then what we've would do is take the objective design standards, the document that we just went over, and distill that down into a checklist. So you can see on the left side, there would be objective standards, and then there would be a determination column to see if standards are applicable or not applicable. And then finally, are they complying with those standards? So not every standard will be applicable to every types of projects. As I mentioned, some of these may not be applicable. For example, if your project is less than 20 dwelling units an acre, or you're on a street type A as opposed to a street type B. So that would be reviewed with the applicant so that they know what standards they need to apply. And so the second piece is that we want to make sure that we're consistent with what the graphics are reviewed and what the narrative is going to be reviewed. So we're gonna have a handout for the developers to say, we're looking for an 11 by 17 drawing that includes these things. So this is an example that necessarily doesn't tell exactly the development, but generally what would be expected for each of those standards that are identified in the checklist. So what are we looking for in terms of plans and elevations? Because what typically happens today, a developer will submit what's called a plan set, which includes everything under the sun, and the staff and also planning commission, as you know, you got to dig your way through it to try to figure out what they've submitted to you. And so we're saying it's the onus is on the applicant to give you a set of 11 by 17 drawings, graphics, and narrative that directly address the ODS. All right, and so this is just some examples for this. So for example, if you had a minimum common area landscaping standard that said 20% of the total site needs to be landscaped, they need to indicate it graphically and then numerically to show where those areas would be. You see that kind of yellowish green. And then they would say, here's our total site, and here's the amount of landscaping. So it's verifiable and measurable. So you're not pulling out a scale and getting markers to measure this, but they're doing it for you. All right. So then when we look at a narrative, the top part you see in black and white would be the standard. So what they need to do is to write the standard down, what's in the ordinance, in the ODS, and then there's a response that you see in blue. You need to describe how they respond to, for example, the site landscaping standards in a paragraph or two. They don't need to write 15 pages. They could if they wanted to, but they need to be able to respond to those standards, how they are compliant with it. And then if there are any associated tables with that, they need to include that as well. So again, we want to make sure that this is applied consistently again and again and again, so you have an understanding what is submitted and what the responses are. So any questions about that? Because I think it's one thing to have a standard, but if you don't have the tools or the understanding how to actually apply these and to review them, they're not very good. So this is what we want to really emphasize, what we were given to the staff, and for other multifamily projects, what we'd anticipate the planning commission, the tools that you would use to evaluate a project. So it's not a he said, she said. Questions about that?
No, not at this. I don't have any, but I have a question for staff. In the event that we have a Spanish speaking applicant, do we have something that can be translated just in case? Because I know we have other documents translated into Spanish as a threshold language here in the community. I was just curious.
Like the application or the
application
objective design standards?
SB,
Yeah,
I'm sorry, what was that?
the SB,
the form,
interpreted.
yeah, just
The
like
form?
at least for them to. apply.
Yeah, that's, you
I'm
know what?
curious, because a lot of other
Yeah,
documents are in
yeah.
second threshold language here. in the
No,
community.
that's very good feedback. We don't have a Spanish version yet, and that document isn't finalized.
Yeah,
that-
it's a good document though. I think this is wonderful.
Yeah, so I think that makes a lot of sense. We'll definitely do that, make that available to the public.
Just in case.
Yeah, definitely.
It's our second, most complex
Definitely.
language in this community.
It happens a lot, so I
Yeah.
think we should do that.
Director, do you feel that with the possibility of just adjustments, that there will be maybe some training that the staff will have to go through to kind of, this was done, this was kind of done previously, but now these are the thresholds that we need to cover, and kind of learning how those applications are submitted? Do you think there's going to be something? I guess the question is, do you feel there'll be a learning curve with these possible changes within the staff?
Oh, yeah, definitely, because this is a big change from what we've normally done. So, we'll be working closely with Don and his team. He's offered providing us training before we actually implement this, so.
So SB 330 It has to be, that's David Bacon, that has to be, it's being built, it has to be all David Bacon, scale with that.
Has
Is
to
that
be, I'm
correct?
sorry, what?
The Davis Bacon. The funding where you're building.
Oh.
You can't pay regular,
Oh, the prevailing wage. Yeah,
Prevailing wage,
yeah. So they have to, they're subject to prevailing wage projects. A lot of times housing laws, when they try to kind of streamline housing, a lot of times there is prevailing wage provisions added to that. And
on the 330, on the SB 330. Okay.
I would say this, that the prevailing wage, I think we probably all agree that it makes some sense for lots of reasons, because we want to make sure that people are getting a family wage job, but it makes less sense in certain parts of the state than others. So if it becomes an issue, SCAG has asked us to identify areas for these sorts of issues that are putting a tamper on the delivery of affordable housing projects. If we could identify this. And so this is one that we'll report back to SCAG. And they can take that information back to the legislature if we have enough communities are getting the same feedback from nonprofit developers and others that say that it's too onerous. And at some point, this could be looked at the legislature, and they may have some other ways of dealing with it. That may be a scale or an omission for certain communities where this is just not viable. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. There may be some other things that we've heard from other communities as well in terms of what some of the things that are holding back affordable housing.
So we're not enforcing that on some of the affordable housing projects in Coachella at all.
no, it's really their choice if they want to go through that process, but there are certain requirements they have to fill. Most projects try to avoid the prevailing wage. That's why we just haven't seen it come in. So it's kind of like the state law wants to make it easier, but at the same time, it has something in there that makes it harder.
Well, in this case, it's to protect wages.
Right, and
I get it.
that's a good thing, right? And so, but it's really up to the developer if they're gonna do that, and it just. It seems like it hasn't made sense for a developer here in the city to do that. We haven't seen it yet.
Okay.
So for example, in some communities, they already have existing prevailing wage laws anyway. And so this gives them a mechanism to say, I've got it, and I can streamline the process without having to go through a lot of other conditions. So some cities, developers see this as a benefit that the prevailing wage is included as part of SB 35, believe it or not. So some other areas, CEQA is a bigger issue. And I don't, a discussion with Gabriel appears to be less of an issue in Coachella than many others. There's also requirements that projects need to be reviewed by local tribes. That may be an issue here. And so there, I don't know or not, but that could add some time to it as well.
Okay.
So, yeah, thank you, Don. But just to close on the presentation, there is a letter that I provided to you that we received from Live to Rise, more in support of the objective design standards. There were two other letters in your packet, one from the Desert Valley Building Association, supportive of this. There was another letter from Colleen Edwards that raised some concerns about adopting the objective design standards as they're presented. And then Colleen is one of the representatives from Chelsea Investments. So they thought there were certain things like the transition zone areas that, kind of the feeling that would be considered like a taking. So that public easement would be considered a taking. So if you could open that PowerPoint real quick, and I'll just go over those comments. And that was the one where it said staff. And then you could probably see, yeah, but if you can add that one. Submitted, yeah.
What are the setback standards, you know?
Yeah, so I'll go over this real quick and Don may want to chime in on this, right? Because
Sure.
there are some questions about this, so I'll address first comment. So this is what I was talking about, the on-site easements for public use represents the taking of land, making a significant area of private sites unbuildable. And so, you know, I think that transition area zone is kind of essential. You know, we can enforce those standards through the objective design standards. But those were comments that they had. Obviously, it's some real estate that they have to sacrifice for more of a semi-public use. But you know, we feel that it's reasonable. Don, do you want to add anything to?
I would say some of your standards today for setbacks may be excessive. And as a way of taking advantage of getting these public easements, you would reduce a front or side yard setback. So the net buildable area is at a minimum equal to what they would have had using the existing setbacks. So there are ways of dealing with this. There are also maybe some adjustments to building heights in some instances, especially in your mixed use zones, where maybe less of an issue as opposed to some of your lower density, lower than 20 units an acre area. So I think it's a good point, but I think there are ways of dealing with it.
One thing that the Planning Commission did do at the last meeting is reduce the setback for multifamily housing from 15 to 10. So we did make it easier for multifamily housing to be developed. So you did reduce it by 5 feet. So
I would suggest, and this is just an editorialization, I think you should have some instances where it could be 0. And as long as they make this objective development standards that you saw that we presented where the building is above grade and there's a grade separation.
The buffer zone, I mean, obviously that's a public safety issue. On the other one, it's yeah, the facades, and that's a privacy issue also. So
That's right.
I think that's important.
Mhm. The next one is vertical modulation is a taking of airspace rights, reducing the buildable area that can be achieved from development sites. This is also creates desirable conditions where elevators service partial floors. I would suggest roof modulation instead. Don, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah. I think that this is again, the vertical modulation that we're suggesting for each of these is fairly minimal. Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to have unmodulated buildings. So the question is, what is the right amount of modulation? Because you need this. This is something that you don't want to have unarticulated, unmodulated boxes that have some articulation of bays and balconies slapped on top of them. You want to mold the form and massing of the overall structure, not applique on it. And the vertical modulation is important to do that. And the modulation is fairly minimal. Some instances we're talking 5 feet. That's not going to be significant in terms of impacts on things like elevator service and partial floors. So that's not going to happen. This only means you're changing maybe floor heights a little bit instead of a 4 to 4, 8 or 10 feet. In some instances, it might be 15. So I think those things that can be worked around. I think it's a red herring.
The third is required depth recesses are taking development rights, decreasing on-site buildable area.
Again, the same issue is that by easing your setbacks and heights, you can adjust these articulation and modulation requirements, modulation in particular. On site. So again, I think it's not unreasonable what's suggested. And
then the last one is entries with step ups to entry doors from public sidewalks require import of large quantities of expensive dirt to raise the floor plates. In the case of flat sites, this feature is typically not financially feasible for affordable housing.
Yeah, and so again, this is an option, not a requirement. So if a developer chooses to have a shallower setback, as we're suggesting is coming up to that built-to line, that they could in turn raise the floor. They're not required to do that, but if they're going to build at grade, we want a setback so that we have that privacy separation so that people aren't looking into windows.
So that was the end of the comments. I think, there's some points that were brought up, but I think staff still feels comfortable with the design standards as presented. And this can always be brought back to the Plan Commission again in the future. And I just want to make sure you have the recommendations on there. But
I think on the multi-story also, you have the cantilever, which also provides a privacy issue. And then the raised floor, obviously, where when you're walking by, you can't look directly into.
everything we're trying to do here is to avoid a box, right? The more that we can avoid a box, this is the only way to do that, is to adopt these objective design standards.
Mhm. And then keep in mind, again, this isn't real prescriptive. We're not requiring specific architectural styles or materials. So it's fairly minimal. As I mentioned, we're regulating what matters and giving flexibility for everything else. So it's not everything under the sun.
I think these are all typical for an architect in terms of design,
Yeah.
doing an apartment complex where, you're providing the high floors and the privacy and
Right.
cantilevers and that kind of stuff to kind of provide the privacy on putting that whole structure together.
Mhm. So keep in mind, my firm's an architecture firm as well. And my partner has been practicing architecture for far longer than we've had our practice. We're in our 25th year and he's got more than that. He's built every type of building. And so these are really crafted from the point of view of an architect and a developer. So what we do know is sometimes in these situations, as an architect, you say, thank God I got these recommendations because now I know what I have to design to.
Exactly.
Because otherwise it's a moving target. And I can meet these standards as long as they're clear and objective. And I think that's really helpful from the designer side.
Yes.
I'm good with this. Chair?
And Chair,
Are we on? Yeah,
also remember this is a public hearing item, so you would need to open and close the public hearing
on this one?
on this one.
Okay, so. $7:20. I'll bring the public hearing.
Anyone on the phone then?
Don't see anyone in the audience that has anyone.
If there's anybody on Zoom who would like to comment on this item, please raise your hand. There are none.
Closing the public comment, 7:20. Are we all done? Don's presentation, huh?
Yes, but Don, do you have anything more to add?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Don. That was very informative and thank you for your presentation. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Okay, we're going on to public hearing calendar.
Before we move on, you would have to, someone would have to make a motion if they want to either support or not support the
Yeah.
adopting this,
The staff recommendation.
and the recommendations are on there.
Okay. So do you have a motion?
Yeah, we have a motion. I like to motion to adopt. Is it the first bullet? That's all the both bullets. Am I supposed to read?
Yeah, you would read both bullets. Yeah.
Fantastic. I motion to approve, find and determine that the zoning ordinance amendment number 22-04 is exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act, SEQA, pursuant to SEQA guidelines, section 15060 C2 and 3 and 16061 B3. And adopt resolution number TC 2023-16, recommending that the city council adopt the ordinance approving zoning ordinance amendment number 22-04, amending municipal code title 17 zoning to require objective design standards for multifamily residential and mixed-use developments. Who seconds that?
Thank you. Do we have a second on that motion?
I'll second that.
That's a mouthful.
Okay, roll call.
Okay. Commissioner Ramirez,
Yes.
Commissioner Arvizo,
Yes.
Commissioner Murillo,
Yes.
alternate Commissioner Fonseca,
Yes.
and Chair Gonzalez.
Yes.
Motion passes.
We have another,
Yes, we have a next item, the fellow warehouses.
okay, we went out to, going on to item 3 on public hearing calendar, Boise Judicial, Coachella warehouses, CUP 276, AR number 1618 modification. The purpose of the CUP 276 AR number 1680 modification is to modify conditions of approval number 20 to clarify offsite improvements for the Coachella warehouse project located on 14.61 acres at 84851 Avenue 48, applicant Verde Real Estate Holdings LLC.
Hello, Planning Commission. Hope you're all doing well this evening. My name is Adrian Moreno, the Associate Partner here at the City of Coachella. I'll be presenting item number 3, the CUP number 276 AR number 16-18 modification Coachella warehouses. So this is a modification of condition of approval number 20 to clarify offsite improvements for the Coachella warehouse project located on 14.61 acres at 84851 Avenue 48. And the applicant is Joe Casidio. And here's a vicinity map to give you a visual of where this project is. It's in the red line there. The general plan designation is industrial district. The zoning is MW wrecking yard zone. And the acreage is 14.61 acres there, as you can see in the red outline. So to give a bit of a background, so on December 21, 2016, the City Council approved resolution number PC 2016-14, a resolution approving AR number 16-18 and CUP number 276 to allow the phased development of a medical marijuana cultivation complex, including 18 industrial buildings totaling 255,800 square feet and an interim use of 18 mobile units on 14.61 acres at 84851 Avenue 48. Then on February 8, 2017, City Council adopted a mitigated negative declaration and mitigation monitoring program, environmental assessment number 16-05 for the project. And then on March 22, 2017, City Council approved a development agreement for the project. These are really the original approvals here, and what this presentation is for the modification that approvals for condition number 20. So as mentioned, this is a phase development project, and here this slide shows the phases of this project. The project is to be conducted in 3 phases. Phase 1 is the construction of 9 buildings totaling 109,000 square feet. As you can see in the blue area there, that's the phase 1 area. Phase 1A includes the interim use facility along Harrison Street. It's the lower left image there. It's green and red. That is the interim use facility on the bottom right corner of the green area there. That's where that interim phase is. There's buildings there, but this is the interim phase before phase 2. And so with phase 2 is the construction of 7 buildings totaling 98,000 square feet and the removal of the phase 1 interim use facility. So the interim use facility is in the green area, but once phase 2 comes in, it'll be looking like what's in there in green. And then phase 3A is the adaptive reuse of existing buildings on the northerly 3.6 acres. It's, you can see a visual on the bottom right corner. Those are the existing buildings on the site. And they're gonna be reused and for this cannabis project. And then phase 3 is eventually the construction of 4 buildings, what you can see in the orange image on the top. So at least for phase 3A is the adaptive reuse of existing buildings, and then when phase 3 comes in, those buildings would be taken down and new buildings would come in. So that's just kind of overall the 3 phases of the project. And what is on site now? As you can see on the image to the right, in the red outline, this is what the project or the site looks like today, right? So as you can see, the blue area is there on the site. They also have the interim use facility, which you can see on the bottom right of that red outline. That would be the interim use facility as part of phase 1A. And the existing buildings on the upper right hand corner of the red outlined area have been through the adaptive reuse process, and they are using that for cannabis. So that just to give you a picture of what is on site, right? As I was saying, phase 1, 1A, and 3A is what's existing on site right now. And the applicant is preparing phase 2 of the project, and as a result, submitted an application for a lot line adjustment for the properties. Staff requires that prior to approval of the lot line adjustment, the applicant is required to receive planning commission approval for the modification of condition of approval number 20 for conditional use permit 276 and architectural review number 16-18 and this modification is really concerning street improvements that have not been completed to date. So that modification is really to clarify those street improvements of the original approval. Right, so this is showing the existing conditions on site, and you can see that those street improvements are not there, right? So this modification is to clarify to make sure those street improvements are done, right? And this is the one condition of approval number 20 that we will that is proposed to be modified here. So item number 20 says applicant shall construct all off-site and on-site improvements, including street pavement, gutter, curb, gutter, sidewalks, street trees, perimeter walls, perimeter landscaping and irrigation, storm drains, streetlights, and any other incidental work necessary to complete the improvements. Driveways shall conform to City of Coachella standard for commercial driveways with a minimum width 24 feet and curved radius entrances. That was the original, that text there is the original condition, but this modification is to include that bolded area, to add that to the condition. And to continue for this modification, street improvement plans shall more specifically conform with the following. Street improvement plans shall be prepared and approved prior to issuance of any building permits. All street improvements shall be installed and accepted by the city prior to the issuance of any certificate of occupancy of any additional buildings. So those first 2 conditions are really so when phase 2 is coming in, we do have those street improvements accepted, approved, and then completed before that certificate of occupancy is issued for phase 2 or for any other buildings, which would be phase 2. And so item C there is dedication of land along the eastbound lane of Avenue 48 and southbound lane of Harrison Street shall be required along the frontage of parcel C as shown on line adjustment number 23-2, Avenue 48 from the center line to the northerly property line shall have a width of 40 feet. Harrison Street from the center line to the eastern property line shall have a width of 40 feet. On Avenue 48, so the northern street there, full curb, gutter, sidewalk, landscaping, lighting shall be completed from the northwest corner of parcel C to the intersection of Harrison Street and Avenue 48, including all offsite frontage work adjacent to parcel A and B as shown on lot line adjustment number 23-2. Street paving and striping transition work shall extend westernly from the northwest property corner, a distance of not less than 200 feet to accomplish standard lane transitioning. And then final item here, E, on Harrison Street, full curb, gutter, sidewalk, landscaping, lighting improvements shall be completed from the southeast corner of parcel C to the intersection of Harrison Street and Avenue 48, including all offsite frontage work adjacent to parcels A as shown on line adjustment 23-2. Street paving and striping transition work shall extend southerly from the southeast property corner a distance of not less than 200 feet to accomplish standard lane transitioning. And I included an image here to kind of get a visual of really the dedications that were mentioned here, the dedications and the other street improvements, full curb, sidewalk, landscaping. And that's a kind of a bit of an illustrative visual to see really what we're trying to, what this modification is trying to accomplish is to make sure those street improvements are done on Avenue 48 and Harrison Street.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I agree. Thank you for your presentation, and for presenting the modifications. I'm clear on understanding what the goal is here at hand, but just because I wasn't here in 2017 or 2016, when the applicant came to request or ask for a CPU, help me understand where's that time frame of the implementation of these three phases, first of all, these phases, because
Right.
if we're trying to modify and
Right.
clarify for these dedications that you just outlined, I'm
Right.
curious as to when will they be implemented? I understand
Right.
you indicated by, before we issue the
Right.
certificate of,
Right.
of operation, but where is the time frame? I'm curious.
Right. At least, right, we were saying, or I was saying in the modification, we're really trying to get those street improvements done for section A and B before phase 2 is completed, before that certificate occupancy. As to when phase 2 will be built, that's on the applicant on his timeline of when he's going to build that out. So I wouldn't have that information.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then the other thing is, since the applicant just came for operation in this wrecking yard, so
Right.
are we cultivating now? Are those buildings erected? Is that the goal to remove the wrecking yard
Right.
to build? Is that where that's where we
Right.
are?
That's
Just for
correct. To
clarification.
remove.
I was like, 'cause there's a lot, I was like, that's a wrecking yard. I know.
Right, right.
Okay.
Yeah,
Pretty
so
cool.
it's to remove that portion, right? You can see a
That's what
lot
I
of
thought.
auto uses,
Yeah, from the
right?
other slides that you have. in
Right,
here.
that won't be a part of this project anymore. It would be now used for the
Cannabis
Coachella
cultivation.
warehouse cannabis cultivation site.
That's a
Right.
lot of weed, if I may say.
Uh,
So with that said, I have another question for
Right.
you. This includes also, for example, like public utilities, because I mean, if it's an indoor cultivation, you're talking about water, light, you're talking about lines. I mean, is that considered in the CPU? Because I know Commissioner Hernandez would not forgive me if I asked that.
Right, right. So at least this modification is really for these offsite improvements. But at least for the water and all of that, that'd be a part of the building permit process.
Yeah, so there would have been a conditional use permit and architectural review. So all the conditions, aside from the condition 20 that are listed with the rest of the conditions, would have outlined how they're supposed to connect to utilities. And so I believe a lot of that has happened already. The biggest concern has been that these street improvements haven't occurred, and that the way the existing condition reads is not very specific on when that's going to occur. So it needs to happen at some point.
Yeah.
But that's why.
I hear you on that, and I understand sometimes it's expensive, especially to build out. I get that, I understand, but I'd love to see, kind of like a timeline. This is my personal opinion as I'm assessing the situation and asking these questions. I like to see a time frame. You know what I mean? Like, where do you anticipate in the next 10 years? I mean, the next 5 years, the next 20 years, I mean, because cannabis can change, the laws can change. I'm just curious
Right.
about that. So if you're promising me that you're promising actually the city of Coachella, that you're gonna make those improvements and in that
Right.
particular area, I want to see that fruition. I'd like to see that happen.
Right.
So that's just,
A legitimate question, so I think it's perfect.
Right.
Commissioner,
applicant-
what I know, well, the applicant, I'm sorry.
No, the applicant, believe is here, so he
Oh,
may
we
be
would
able
love
to answer
speak
those
with that.
questions.
That'd be amazing.
Let me make a real quick point brought up in the past, I see all the improvements, the outside improvements. One of the things I brought up in the past too was the bike lane. I don't see anything identified with the bike lane, because, I'm sure there's people out there that are gonna be riding their bike to frequent some of these facilities. So is there a bike lane that's been specifically allocated on that, on all the improvements here?
I don't know, and then I would, Andrew's not part of the.
If they're not,
on
if
the
there isn't. To stipulate that we include a bike lane in these improvements, because believe me, I'm sure there's gonna be people out there, on their bikes, and I just want to make sure that it's a safe area where, they're gonna be able to ride their bikes.
Yeah, and I just don't have enough information on that from the city engineer. I guess you could do that along the frontage here. It's just that, I don't know if this would be a dedicated bike lane all the way down the street so that it's consistent. That's the only thing I don't know, right?
I think I brought it up in the past, and my
Yeah.
position was that we identify one coming off the bridge there and then going into that whole area on 48.
Okay. Yeah, I can't tell by the language here if that would end up being included by the city engineer, Andrew Simmons. So you might want to include language, about that. Either if you require it or if feasible by the city engineer, but up to the planning commission.
Can we do that? Can make a motion to include a bike lane in that whole general area?
I think we should get some plans to see if it's actually feasible. I think we can do that, right?
Yeah, I would include it, but based on if the city engineer determines it's feasible, right? You don't want to have something where it doesn't connect and for some reason a bike lane doesn't fit. I just don't know the answer to that. He would have.
You have sidewalk, I don't think it'd be, would be, all these improvements, you have the landscape and all that, I'm sure that we could fit it in there somewhere.
Yeah, I think that would probably be the best wording then, to add a bike lane, if to the satisfaction of the city engineer, if feasible.
Yeah.
So that's what I would recommend.
Okay, so do we make a motion on that, or?
Yeah, I don't know, Adrian, are you at the end of your report?
I have a bit more.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh,
okay.
please, that's you. I have a question though, I'm sorry, because we're talking about clarification and modifying this
Right.
CPU for clarification.
Right,
When you indicate that there's a landscape, I did not see a landscape plan or anything like that. Did I miss that?
right, so.
Because I think we
It's
talked.
Right, so it'd be part of the street improvement plans, so they would submit landscaping to us, and what we're really ensuring here in item A is that street improvement plans shall be prepared to approve prior to issuance of any future building permits. So if they want to do phase 2, those street improvement plans would have that landscaping there.
So that would be at the discretion now at the city staff to review those plans when that time comes, correct? Is that what I'm
Right,
hearing? Okay, so they're not here now.
they're not here now,
Correct.
no, but when they do come, when they are planning to build phase 2, that's something that they will submit,
Okay.
right? And then just to go over the environmental review, on February 8, 2017, the city council adopted or approved resolution 2017-02, which adopted a mitigated negative declaration and mitigation monitoring program, environmental assessment number 1605 for the project. The proposed modified condition would clarify existing project requirements for street improvements on Avenue 48 and Harrison Street and would not result in any new project impacts beyond those evaluated in environmental assessment number 16-05. So recommendation and staff recommendation, staff recommends that the planning commission approve resolution PC 2023-15 conditional use permit number 276 and architectural review number 16-18 modification of condition of approval number 20 to clarify off-site improvements for the Coachella warehouse project located on 14.61 acres at 84851 Avenue 48. And that is my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
The applicant's on the line, correct?
No.
Yeah, the applicant's on the line.
Yeah, so if you want to hear from them and hear a presentation, you open the public hearing.
So just as clarification, is phase 1 already actively, are they there already doing something? Or is this already operational? Is my question.
Right.
It
Yes.
is.
Yeah,
So even though it's already operational,
right.
there's still
There's still
the
going,
question about the streets.
right, there was,
It was part of phase 1,
right,
and now they're requesting this modification to be able to use phase 2
right,
without phase 1 being completed.
Right, so those street improvement plans haven't, as you saw in the presentation, they're not there, right? So it was really, this modification is to clarify when those street improvement plans will be done. So before phase two, any new buildings can get a building permit or a certificate of occupancy. We do need to see those street improvement plans approved, accepted, and the street improvement plans are constructed before a certificate of occupancy. So really, this modification is to ensure those are done before any new buildings are approved for phase two.
And there's a building in phase one that hasn't received a certificate of occupancy, so then that would apply to that building too.
Is that clarified in this modification?
Yes, because it
Didn't
says
see
before
that.
any further certificate of occupancy. That would apply
That was
to.
a bit ambiguous for me. It was not clear to me.
So going back to the question of Commissioner Ramirez asking, there's no way of us, obviously the applicants are asking them, can we ask them directly if they have a timeline to get this effectively completed? Is that an appropriate question to ask?
Right, they
Yes.
should be on here. They plan to be on here, so we'll see.
Let's open it to public hearing, Chairman, if it's okay with you.
Okay, yeah, could we open up or public hearing, we're gonna open up the public hearing in Coachella Warehouse. CUP 271, AR number 1618, modification at 743.
Yes, we have one hand raised. Verde Partners, go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, awesome. Great. Hello, all. My name is Joe Corcio. I am the applicant for Verde Real Estate Holdings. Thank you for your consideration and your time this evening. There were a lot of questions asked by the council members, so I'll answer them to the best of my recollection. If I do miss any, please feel free to ask another question. It would be helpful if it's possible to kind of roll back some of those slides to show some of the pictures of the status, because those are very old pictures. And it would be help maybe the visual as I'm describing the status to see what has been done since those last few pictures.
Do you have the upgraded pictures? Do we have upgraded pictures, staff of,
Those might have been the latest ones that were available either online, but
Right.
but it looks like he wants us to go back to the latest, what Adrian has in his presentation to describe maybe what's.
That slide yeah, either one of those slides would be great if we can freeze it there. Awesome, thank you. So as you can see, I'm looking at the actual picture of the aerial there. Those white roofs you see are the existing, actually the bottom left-hand corner is now constructed as well. There should be another roof there. This is probably at least a year or two old, this picture. So all 9 buildings on phase 1 are in some form of construction phase. We are expecting to get a COO or apply for a COO on 2 of the buildings within the next 3 months. The 2 buildings in the lower right-hand corner there, those are would be the remaining 2 buildings to be finished and applied for a COO on phase 1. There was and so there was just a question brought up that we would hope to get those COOs for phase 1 we would get the exception to get those COOs prior to this requirement for having the offsites done for any additional COOs on phase 2. These buildings are very close to being done. We can, people can go to work. There's a lot of benefit to having those buildings completed and occupied. It is our full intention to do the offsites, the required offsites and on-site improvements subsequent to the purchase of phase 2 before we ask for building permits and COOs on phase 2. That the phase 2 would be that anything right of the lower right-hand corner where you see all those cars have been cleared. There's been another environmental report done. It is a clean environmental report. the lower right-hand corner, the temporary facility, that's been cleared outside of one of our own construction trailers. So that is, phase 2 is ready to be developed. It is our intention to buy phase 2 in the very near future, in the next 3 months, hopefully sooner. Once purchased, there needs to be a sewer line. There was a question before about utilities. There's a sewer line that needs to run through phase 2 to tie into Harrison Street. That will be one of the first improvements, an on-site improvement, in addition to the off-sites to go around on the street side. All of that is expected to be done, I would say, in the next 6 months to a year, depending on construction timelines.
May I ask a question, please, just for
Of
clarification?
course, yes.
You indicated, if you go back, okay, perfect, the slide. You indicated 3 out of the 9 buildings you have currently in this space, that out of those 3, you're going for COO, correct?
We have 5 buildings are occupied right now.
So 5 are currently occupied, so they have right now COOs in place. Is that
Correct, correct.
Okay, so then, so now just to stand corrected, so the other 4 you're going for at what point? In the next
2
3 months?
2 more will be applied for, and then the 1 will be applied for actually in the next 2 weeks or so.
Okay. that makes
The second one, which would be the lower left-hand corner, which now is built, would be, we're hoping to go live in that building early September.
Okay, because that clarifies a little bit, because initially it was not clear.
Yeah.
And then, so then you're anticipating for phase 2 then for 2024, is that what I understand?
Yes, phase 2 would be, we could hopefully, if we get this funding solidified in the near future, we're hoping to do at least the offsites in 2023. I should say the onsites, the grading and the sewer requirement, get that done in 2023. If we can do the offsites, the required offsites, the street in 2023, we're happy to do that as soon as possible, because, to the point of this conversation, we cannot apply for building permits on the buildings until that's all done. So it's in our best interest to, once we get this property acquired, to move forward as quickly as possible.
And how certain is phase 2 of this project happening? Like how certain? Just
I'm
curious.
sorry?
How certain is phase 2 for 2024?
I would say if the funding is required as expected in the next few weeks, then it really just falls onto construction timelines. There's been, some things it takes a while, back orders, if you will, but assuming normal delivery times and timelines, we would be hopeful that it is, I wouldn't say complete in 2024, but I would say a good halfway through with a completion in 2025. Because there's another 100,000 square feet of building to be done there.
Yeah, so that's expensive. And so I'm just wondering, I mean, is Better Partners really committed for, to doing these modifications, these side modifications for this conditional of approval for this CPU? Because if you're waiting for funds, this is what I'm hearing. And I'm just trying to, I want to help you, but also I'm trying to be mindful of the community itself. You have these plans for landscape, you have these plans for site, that's a lot of additional money as well in water. So I'm just curious, and it's all conditioned to, getting this done before we start phase 2, or is it phase 2 and then we get this done? Help me.
The proposal in front of you is to have all that done prior to phase 2. From my perspective, in all honesty, I would love to say, hey, let me build the buildings first. Get the, get revenue, get the property taxes flowing, you guys get the development fees, you get the property taxes, we got people working, the cannabis tax comes into play, and then allows me to do the offsites. Of course I would want it the other way, but I understand your concerns. And I will play by, how you feel best to lay it out.
No, I appreciate your authentic conversation, and I want to, be a partner in this. It's just we're trying to figure out how we can figure this out. Any comments from the commission? On
for me, the thing that goes back to is that this was already part of phase 1, and so it was very, strictly written what was phase one to phase two. I'm just having a hard time understanding, this next part, but we'll see what we decide, so we'll go from there.
Anybody,
I'm sorry, one more thing. I just asked of the staff, like, if you already made this commitment and this, this pact with, the Verde partners that, when that time comes, please, make sure that the site items that are in this modification plan that they, are fulfilled. That's all.
yeah, we enforce some conditions.
Yeah.
Excuse
And
me.
if you can send and if you can send oh, sorry.
Are we done with public comments? Or
Yeah,
Any
it's, are we done? Any more questions?
Looks like there's still the hand up, so you want to double check?
Yeah, could we, go ahead, whoever has their hand up?
Thank you.
if there's anybody else who would like to comment on this item, please raise your hand.
Hi, it's Joe again.
Joe.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, go
Great.
ahead.
There was a couple comments. Well, I believe one of the council members mentioned that this happened all before she was there. This all happened before I was here as well. So I can respect what was done back in 2016 and 17. All I can say to that is at the time, the cannabis industry was new. Nobody really understood or knew what was going to happen. Fast forward to now, we are really the only project that has succeeded on this avenue, where others have a lot of properties have been bought, a lot of money was spent, and nothing was developed. We persevered and battled through and to get to where we are. So I understand at the time, that may have been hey, we want the streets done and the sidewalks done, and there was an order, a perceived order of, how it should look. And I totally respect that. The times have changed, and we're pretty much the only survivor that I am committed to getting this done. I will be happy to put the roads and the sidewalks and a bike lane. If not, I'm a big biker. I've done multiple triathlons, so I'm a biker at heart. So I support all bike lanes. But I would just respectfully request that be considered, that the times has changed. So the order, maybe there's some consideration to the order of being done, and I do appreciate the forgiveness that's already been granted in allowing me to finish phase one without the condition of putting in the improvements. If there's something that could be worked on with phase two, I'm all for it, but I do respect the order that would be presented. And if we have to do the offsites, so be it. I will make those offsites happen. But as a cost concession, those could also go into building a building or two, generating jobs and taxes. But again, I will respect the wishes of the council and abide by, how you see fit.
Thank you, Joe, for that perspective. Appreciate it. Yeah, that's the only condition I see as a bike lane. I'm concerned about, the safety of people riding bikes in that area. So yeah, I'm willing to move on. So can you put up on the screen on what the city
The
the recommendation?
Yeah.
Let me close. Are we all done, Joe? So I can
Yeah.
I'm gonna close the public comment.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, so much
Thank you.
for closing the public comment at 7:56.
Chair, if I clarify one thing, so the way that the condition reads is that before any future certificate of occupancy is issued, and it doesn't say by any phase. So this would technically apply to the two buildings in phase one that they haven't received a certificate of occupancy. So I think the applicant's looking for flexibility on this condition. The way that we would apply this condition, and Andrew Simmons, the city engineer, and I have had a discussion with the applicants that we would hold off on the last certificate of occupancy for phase one if these improvements weren't done. Now, the applicant's looking for something beyond that. He wants to get these done and then we'll do the street improvements afterwards. That was a little bit, that's different than our understanding. I would say if you are amenable to change anything what the applicant wants, I mean, I think we would need something more in terms of than timing, right? Because, we don't know when a building in phase 2 would be constructed. It could be 5 years from now, right? Ideally it would be as soon as possible. Maybe the applicant wants to do that as soon as possible. But, I think we need something that allows us to ensure that street comes in sometime soon.
So there was never a conversation in reference to specifically when that would take place.
Well, the conditions, if you read the condition that's not in bold, it doesn't have a particular time frame.
Yeah.
So the city engineer wants to make sure it gets done. And so this is really up to the planning commission what you want to do.
Yeah, but he just said that he was willing to, to do whatever it takes to get it done. So I don't know what we stipulate in the condition that he needs to have it done before he gets his next certificate of occupancy or after the certificate. He's got 2 buildings that are pretty close to finishing. Is that correct?
Right, correct.
Okay, so I don't know, it's the wishes of the commission, but I would recommend that we let him finish the 2 buildings and then put a condition that he can't start the next phase till he gets all the improvements done.
Well, he had mentioned something about submitting the COO with it for at least one of the buildings, right?
He's already
He's
anticipating
only
in a
3
few weeks.
weeks, yeah, he just said
He's
he-
anticipating COO in 2 weeks, so
Or just one of them?
for
or
one
both
and
of
then for 2, so actually there'll be 5, 6, 7, it's about 7 of them.
I think the flip side is that, we're obviously it's an employee, employing some more local residents.
Of course, yeah.
So that's a big plus, and we just, we gotta make sure that he finishes
Yeah.
these improvements, and that, we just don't,
I'm okay with what you said, actually, where, like, hey, get through phase 1 and before you start phase 2, we gotta see some, you gotta break ground and start fixing these areas, putting that bike lane for people who bike to work, because there's people that bike to work in our community, and that kind of
Okay.
thing. What do you
So-
guys think?
I mean, he did mention that it would be in 2024 when they would start phase 2, right? So we're assuming that towards the end, right? Assuming that time frame
And money?
Yeah, assuming the money is there, that then we would get the offsite stuff done by the end of the year.
the city's creating revenue anyway, he's got the cannabis tax and all the other stuff that he's
Yeah,
providing the city.
Expensive. Because I would say at least break ground and start working on the offsite stuff before starting phase 2. At
Yeah.
least start working.
You wanna take care of that and the staff, or
Yeah.
do you want us to weigh in on it, or what do you recommend? Because you guys have been in conversation already, so you know all the intricate
Yeah, I mean,
detail.
so if planning commission wants to be flexible with that, I would suggest someone should make the motion. And then if it's regarding before any construction on phase 2, then add that to the motion.
Okay, so let's, you wanna do that?
I'm happy to
You
do
wanna-
it, absolutely.
Okay,
And I'll add the or Gabriel, at the end, should I indicate that part about phase 2?
oh, no, don't forget the.
Yeah, and you don't necessarily need to read the whole recommendation. You can just say approve resolution as identified with the stipulation of street improvements occurring with phase 2 before construction of phase 2.
I'll do my best.
I think sometimes maybe not all of the recommendations.
Sure. So I motion to approve resolution PC 2023-15, conditional use permit number 276 and architectural review number 16-18 modification. That is to clarify offsite improvements for the Coachella warehouse project located on 14.61 acres at 84-851 Avenue 48, with the stipulations of having a bike lane connected to the offsite improvements and to, if feasible, according to feasibility of the city manager, right? Something along those lines. City engineer, sorry. And what was the other one that we indicated? One more thing. Prior to phase 2, to start working on the offsite improvements to include the bike lane, if feasible.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Everybody in agreement?
Yeah,
You have a second on that motion?
I'll second that.
Okay, so
Who was the first on that? That was with the motion?
I
That was, okay. Sorry about that. Okay,
we got a motion from
Yes.
Commissioner Ramirez.
okay.
So just to clarify, so by voting this, they're still able to finish the buildings that they're finishing within the phase one plan, right?
Yes.
So they're still gonna be able to get that tax and people working,
Yeah.
right? We're just speculating that everything else that was already part of phase one cannot move forward until that's done to start phase two, right? Just to, sorry,
Well said.
my brain, it
No,
just.
it's not.
So I feel that that's the clarification.
Yeah,
Okay,
and then this now will go to city council for,
correct.
yeah.
So this will actually stop with. planning
Oh, it's right here for this one, okay. Oh, there you go. I do want to ask that once phase two does begin, or anything on that, that if there's a consent item, just as an update to us on this, that would be awesome.
Okay, yeah, we'll definitely do
Another consent item.
that. All right,
It's
makes
part of the
sense.
recommendation.
Commissioner Ramirez,
Yes.
Commissioner Arvizo,
Yes.
Commissioner Murillo,
Yes.
alternate Commissioner Fonseca,
Yes.
and Chair Gonzalez.
Yes,
Okay, motion passes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
for
you for your
bringing it
presentation,
here.
For your work.
thank you. Ready, item 4.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, we're gonna close.
Yeah, that's the correct one. Thank you. All right, well, thanks to IT for recovering my presentation.
Yeah, okay, cool.
It's been a long day, guys.
I know, I'm telling you.
I'm trying here.
Item number 4, the general,
Okay, thank you, Chair, members of the Plan Commission, Gabriel Perez, your Development Service Director. So this item is the general plan amendment and environmental assessment called the General Plan Addendum Project. Just some background, we've talked about what a general plan is, that's the blueprint for the city. The zoning code really needs to follow the goals and policies of the general plan. There was an environmental impact report prepared with the general plan to evaluate all the impacts of future growth in the city. It also, the general plan establishes all the land use designations in the city in terms of what you can do, how the city is going to grow in certain areas, where are the industrial areas, where are the commercial, where are the residential areas. A lot of what the general plan has, it's kind of a mandate by the state that cities have a general plan. But it also identifies in the government code that, you know, every city and county adopt a general plan and that it cover the city's planning area. So I'm going to go into that in a little bit of what the planning area is, because that's relevant to this project. So this relates to a request that the city has put in and is interested in submitting again to the county board that makes decisions about the future growth of cities in the Riverside County. And that's the local agency formation commission. They make decisions of our future boundaries. And that a lot of times is regulated by a sphere of influence for a city. The sphere of influence is really the area that the city could grow into. So if you have a sphere of influence, those properties in the sphere of influence could choose to annex into the city in the future and then expand the boundaries of the city. So in 1983, this is actually what the sphere of influence of the city of Coachella looked like. That boundary went all the way to Jefferson Street, which is present day La Quinta. It actually covered half of the polo grounds, which is now in the city of Indio. And then some of that sphere of influence also covers areas that are now in the city of Coachella. City of Coachella is shown in the blue boundary. And there's a little island that covers the Coachella Valley High School. So that's changed a lot. So our sphere of influence actually been reduced on the west side so that it only goes to Calhoun Street. If you could see the dash lines. So that's our sphere of influence of what it's been reduced to. If you go back here, you can see Calhoun. I don't know if I can print it out, but well, Jefferson to Calhoun, that's a big distance, right? It's probably more than a mile, 2 miles where the sphere of influence was reduced. Maybe that works. Okay. That's okay. I can manage here. So one of the areas that is not in the sphere of influence is this area here. It's bounded by Jackson Street, Avenue 52 on the south, Calhoun Street on the east, and there's no street to the north. But that would be the La Colonia subdivision. But there is some sphere of influence to the east of Calhoun that could potentially be annexed to the city in the future. Because this area is not designated as a sphere of influence, cities could petition LAFCO to include it in their sphere of influence, which means that those properties could be annexed into the city in the future. This area did used to be in the sphere of influence back in 2006. 2006, LAFCO made a decision, one, to recommend inclusion into the city of La Quinta sphere of influence, but then the city of La Quinta requested that LAFCO remove it from the sphere of influence because they believed, based on where the location was, they could not service this area. So instead, LAFCO decided that it would belong in no one's sphere of influence. But to this date, the city of Coachella has expressed interest in including this in the sphere of influence, but so has the city of Indio. Just a larger, wider look at the P7 area. You can see the zip code boundary of 92236 is along Jackson Street. It also covers the around the Desert Cree Academy and the cemetery, and then back down south on Jackson Street. So everyone in P7 is actually addressed as Coachella. So they'll receive their mail as Coachella. A lot of the residents that I spoke with yesterday, some of them thought they were in the city of Coachella, right? So, I kind of bring that because a lot of times LAFCO looks at logical boundaries, and because of where the zip code is, it makes sense that P7 would be in the city in the future. So when we presented our application to LAFCO, requesting that it be included in our sphere of influence, we were not successful. One of the things that LAFCO brought up is that as a prerequisite to be considered, that the area had to be evaluated in the general plan. And so earlier I brought up the planning area. And so the city has established a planning area that the general plan will evaluate, as well as the environmental impact report. So there are 3 areas that are planning areas that did not have a general plan land use designation. You can see the arrow at the north, which is north of Avenue 44, down south near the Avenue 62 area near Mecca, and then the area that I pointed out earlier, which is known as the P7 area, north of Avenue 52. So we decided to go through an effort of creating the land uses for those areas since they were not designated. And this is what that would look like. So, I'm sorry, it's not. So the P7 area would have 2 different land uses. What we did to create the land uses was to look at the underlying county designation. So because those areas are still technically in the county, they're subject to the regulations and the land use standards of the county. So I'll go into that here. So we looked at the county regulations for the P7 area, right? The area that I talked about on the west side. And they have a land use designation of state density residential, which is very low density, 0.2 dwelling units to 0.5 dwelling units per acre. Allows for detached single family, limited agriculture and animal keeping. That property at the corner of Jackson Street and Avenue 52, a lot of you have seen it before. That's the Forest Lawn facility. That's actually zoned commercial retail in the city, and allows for retail. We looked at the zoning with the county too, very similar land use, and it actually, the zoning allows for a higher density of 2.2 dwelling units per acre, allows for light agriculture and commercial as well. So what we decided to do was create a new general plan land use designation called estate rancho. So we don't have that in our legend for general plan land uses. And it would establish a density range between 1 to 2.2 dwelling units an acre. And then as well, it would identify that corner where the forest lawn is as suburban retail. And this describes that a little bit more. So the general plan designation would be that estate rancho that would be created with action recommended by the Planning Commission and City Council. The suburban retail land use. The consistent zone with estate rancho is actually a zone called residential estate. We have that zoning designation already. It would allow for a density of 1 to 2.2 dwelling units per acre, consistent with the general plan. The allowable uses in the residential estate zone are single family homes, private parks by right. It does allow for limited agriculture and as accessory to single family homes. With the CUP, you can get approval of a club, lodge, golf courses and schools. The consistent zoning for that forest lawn would be the commercial general zone so that they can continue to allow for retail if they wanted to in the future. So the area we looked at is that northern area that's north of Avenue 44. That area currently is not in our sphere of influence as well. It's actually in the city of Indio's sphere of influence. We haven't expressed any interest in including on our sphere, but because we didn't have any general plan land use designations for this planning area, we wanted to make sure that we were consistent with all our planning areas. So with this, we looked at the county designation, which has 2 designations out here. One is public facilities. That's the location of the Bird Tech waste transfer station. And then the green areas are open space rural. So looking at these standards, we also looked at the zoning. So again, it's very low density residential. And then the other is natural assets in the county zoning. So, you know, what we decided to do is designate this area with the agricultural rancho general plan designation. It's a designation we currently do have in our general plan, which allows for a density between 0.025 dwelling units per acre or 1 unit per parcel. So if you had an acre parcel, you could do one unit of that parcel. The other, the Bird Tech facility would be public facilities, which is another designation we have in our general plan. The consistent zoning with agricultural rancho would be agricultural reserve zoning, which also allows for a similar density range for housing, but also allows for agriculture and animal raising. Then the last area is the southern planning area. And this is south of Avenue 60 all the way down to Avenue 62. This would be east of the 86 Expressway. And so we looked at the underlying county designations. So it looks like they have a lot of colors. And the reason why it has all those colors is that there's a specific plan in the county called the Panorama Specific Plan that was planned around the future College of the Desert campus for the East Valley. And so the areas that are in pink are agriculture. So, and then we looked at the zoning as well, which is similar. It recognizes specific plan, but around it is heavy agriculture. So what we're proposing as general plan land use is agricultural rancho as well. But for the actual specific plan, we would just recognize the county specific plan, the panorama specific plan, and allow that to be the governing document for the development of that site in the future, which makes sense. There was already a plan for that area to include the future College of the Desert. And so as part of this consideration, you know, there was an addendum that was prepared. What an addendum is it's an evaluation of the environmental impacts of a certain action that's being taken to determine if there's any kind of significant impacts that were not evaluated with the general plan environmental impact report. So since this is the general plan amendment, we need to make sure that it's consistent with that general plan amendment environmental impact report. Otherwise, we have to amend it. But this addendum identifies that there are no substantial changes to the project with these proposed general plan land use designations that would require any kind of major revisions to the certified EIR. There haven't been substantial changes that have occurred in the circumstances that would require major revisions to that EIR or to disclose new significant environmental effects that would result in a substantial increase in severity of the impacts identified in the EIR. And there's no new information of substantial importance that was not known at the time of the 2015 program EIR when it was certified. So with that, staff does recommend the Planning Commission adopt the resolution 2023-18 adopting the addendum to the general plan update environmental impact report, finding that the additional environmental review is not required pursuant to CEQA. Adopt the resolution 2023-17 approving the general plan amendments, approving the text modifications to the land use community character element, as well as modifications to figure 4-23 of the land use and community character element. But in addition to that, I want to point out, I think, was there a table that was provided in front of you?
Yeah.
So that was inadvertently omitted, but what that does is identify the state rancho which is the new designation that we would add. So we need to have it in that table.
Real quick, Gabe, on the agricultural rancho on the CUP, can we create that as a school zone also, or just on the rancho state?
You wouldn't be able to establish new land uses. Oh, you're talking about the state rancho?
Yeah, because you said on the state rancho that with the CUP, you could create a school site.
Yeah, you could.
And the question is on the ag rancho, can we create a school site with the CUP or?
You could, but I don't think you need to do that because if it's a public school, they don't need to go under our existing zoning regulations.
Okay.
Yeah, so you don't have to worry about that, unless if it was a private school. The last thing I want to bring your attention to, this came to my attention today by our consultant, that they identified that there's a general plan policy that identifies that annexation of new land to the city when at least 60% of the land within the city limits is built with urban uses or permanently preserved open space. So it really limits when we could do annexations until the city's about 60% built out. You know, we're probably less than 50% built out. And so so we recommend that the Planning Commission recommend to council deletion of that policy. In discussions with our CEQA consultant as well as the city attorney, it was recommended that that the addendum document may need to be revised to include the deletion of that policy, and then we may need to revise the findings for one of the resolutions. So one of the things that we'd like to do is obviously present this to you, but continue this so that we can make that modification to the CEQA document. So next time, you know, when we present this item again, we could just present that one change and we would bring that back to the Planning Commission on July 5th.
Yeah, perfect.
But that's the only reason why we would continue it, is just to make sure that we are crossing the T's and dotting the I's on this proposal.
I appreciate
Good
the
job.
yeah, I appreciate the consultant bringing that to your attention, because currently the people, for example, in that P7, the sphere of influence, already are using their land in a particular way, and the counties allowed it. And so even though it's designated like, you know, as an unknown space or open space because it doesn't belong to a city, I don't want to, you know what I mean? They already, it's their property, you know, I'm a landowner, so I appreciate that response, and I appreciate the recommendation from the staff on that.
Yeah,
So,
and
yeah.
just so you know, the CEQA consultant is also participating. We did talk to them earlier, and they felt the change of deleting that general plan policy would be pretty, pretty easy to do with the
Okay.
addendum. So it wouldn't be a big change. We still would be able to make the similar
Got it.
findings.
Okay, and then we can go and revisit that. I have two questions, Director. So for the northern project area and for the southern project area, so let's talk about the first part, the northern part where Vertic is in that area. Is that a 92201 zip code? Is that Indio or is within the Coachella zip code?
That's a good question. I don't know about that area specifically.
Okay. I'm just curious because I know it's
Could be
like,
county too.
it's county, but like, for example, P7 is 92236, that's Coachella. So I'm just curious if it has a similar effect.
Mhm.
You know, because I love that we're expanding, we're growing. And let's say we go for that additional territory, you know, to be considered the city of Coachella, I would want to be ready to go to LAPCO and say, hey, it's already in our zip code, we're already servicing, already
Yeah.
doing it, kind of like a P7 situation.
Right.
So,
CB High School Coachella has we brought into the city.
so it's not been an issue then?
No,
huh?
it's-
Okay,
it still has a thermal
zip code,
zip code.
okay, so same thing within the southern, yeah,
Mhm.
just look into the zip code.
Yeah,
I'm
I'll
just
definitely look
curious.
in next time we bring this
I get
back.
excited about this. So, yeah, anyways, thank you.
Good job, Express. Good job, and staff. Wendy for all that awesome work.
Should we motion to,
Yeah, what do you want a motion to, on staff recommendation on the plan?
let's do it. Is that,
Chair, I would recommend that you open the public hearing.
that's right. Is there someone on the line?
I would remind you, staff has recommended that you're recommending that we continue the item to the next meeting.
Okay, so you actually asking for continuance at this point.
Yeah,
I
so that-
apologize, I misunderstood you.
So that way we can work on the modifications to the addendum.
Oh, understood. So you take
so-
everything already all at once.
So those changes that made, we were thinking that those changes could be made after the planning commission makes the recommendation to the council, but just for,
Understood.
just to be safe, we'd like to bring that back to the planning commission.
So with those recommendations, the secret feel, obviously nothing's ever a slam dunk, Director, but there's a feeling is as with these adjustments that were made with, the new, estate rancho and all these adjustments with the general plan. The hope is obviously is that this could be incorporated through process, right? Is that?
That would be the
because
hope.
This is a lot of work just to kind of feel like, oh, well. But obviously there's never 100%, but is the feeling with this, with you and your team that this will be approved?
That is our hope for the area that I mentioned earlier between Jackson and Calhoun. When this application was before LAFCO. Some of the commissioners did mention that they believe the area did belong in Coachella, but they felt that there was a step that we needed to take, which was identify the land uses there.
That was a sticky part.
Okay, and the public hearing calendar, quasi judicial item
Yeah.
number
Wait,
4.
open
Yeah, I'm gonna-
hearing.
Yeah, I'm gonna open it up. Item 4, general plan, addendum number 2303, the environmental assessment number 2303, general plan addendum project, open up the hearing.
And then, so they should continue it with the public hearing open?
They can open and close it and continue that.
Okay. So then if, so I guess, I don't know if there's anyone.
Anybody in the public?
There's anybody on Zoom who'd like to comment on this item, please raise your hand. There are not.
Okay, closing the public comment on the general plan addendum number 23-03, environmental assessment number 2303, general plan addendum project.
And just remember, our staff recommendation is that it be continued to the next meeting of July 5th.
Bring the zip codes. Please, I'm just curious for the northern southern project.
We'll do.
Thank you.
So you do have to. So.
Okay.
There's a motion to continue.
I'm motion
Yeah,
to
okay.
continue for the July 5th meeting, general plan amendment number 23-03 and environmental assessment number 23-03, general plan amendment project.
Perfect. You have a second on that motion?
I'll second that.
Thank you. Commissioner Moore.
Commissioner Ramirez.
Yes.
Commissioner Arvizo,
Yes.
Commissioner Murillo,
Yes.
alternate Commissioner Fonseca,
Yes.
and Chair Gonzalez.
Yes. Okay, going on to item number 5, the airport business changes zone. That item has been tabled, is that correct?
Yes,
Okay, so,
it's been tabled. You might recall the last time it was continued to this meeting. And the applicant is preparing an environmental impact report for that project.
okay, perfect. So moving on to informational.
I don't have much items, just tomorrow Aldi is supposed to open and I sent an invitation for you for that officials grand opening. So
Free everything?
I don't know what they're having there, so it'll be a surprise.
Bring back and we get there on time.
Okay,
So that's good news for the city.
going on to informational, the 6 directors development update. Anything?
Just so you know, typically the plan commission goes dark in August, so we wouldn't have any meetings. So hopefully that works for the commission. We are trying to work to get everything in front of the plan commission before the end of July. So that's why we've been having pretty long meetings. So we'll probably have a long meeting July 5th and then one for the last meeting in July, and then we'll have a break.
Okay, perfect. And number 7, the development service, tentative future agenda.
Just a couple of things. There's a possibility that the housing element may be presented before the planning commission July 5th. There are a couple remaining comments we're working through with the state. So it may go July 5th. If not, it may be the last meeting in July. So that's a pretty big item, right? That's planning for future housing in the city. And just trying to think if there's anything else. And then that's really one of the last bigger projects that goes before the planning commission before we take a break.
Okay, perfect. Is there a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Motion to adjourn the meeting.
Adjourn the meeting at 8:28. Thank you all, commissioners. Good
Thank you,
job.
guys.
Good job.